The galaxy had known war in many forms. It had known the grinding attrition of the Clone Wars, the surgical brutality of imperial pacification campaigns, and the cold mathematics of mutually assured destruction that kept star systems in line through fear rather than loyalty. The Galactic Empire had, in the span of 2 decades, transformed the galaxy's understanding of power. Power was a super-star destroyer hanging in low orbit above a rebellious world. Power was the Death Star's single green beam reducing a planet to cooling debris. Power was Darth Vader stepping through a breached airlock door, cape settling around him like a black shroud, and every armed soldier in the corridor deciding that surrender was the only logical option. The Empire did not fear the unknown. It had categorized the unknown, filed it, assigned it a threat assessment rating, and dispatched the appropriate tonnage of weapons to neutralize it. That system had worked for 20 years. There was no reason, on the morning that Commander Turin Vash of the Imperial Patrol vessel Iron Meridian filed his initial contact report, to believe it would ever stop working. Vash had been on routine deep space patrol in the Outer Rim territories, 3 days' travel beyond the Saswena sector, when his sensor officer had flagged the anomaly. Not an anomaly in the romantic, mysterious sense that Academy instructors sometimes use to make cadets feel the galaxy was still full of wonder. An anomaly in the bureaucratic sense, a sensor return that did not match any catalogued vessel profile in the Imperial Registry. The return was large. Extraordinarily large. A cluster of objects moving in formation, their drive signatures producing energy readings that did not correspond to any known propulsion system. Not ion drives. Not hyperdrive motivators cycling up. Something else entirely, generating a low-frequency resonance that made the Iron Meridian's hull sensors vibrate at the edge of detection, like a sound heard more through the chest than the ears. Vash had done what any competent Imperial officer did when confronted with the unknown. He had moved toward it. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or universe you'd want to see collide with Star Wars in the comments below. Now, back to Commander Vash, because what he found at the edge of Imperial space was about to change everything. The objects resolved on his forward viewport over the course of 40 minutes, growing from sensor ghosts to faint geometric shapes to something that made his sensor officer stop talking mid-sentence. They were not ships in any Imperial understanding of the word. Imperial vessels had lines, clean, angular, purposeful lines that communicated function and dominance in equal measure. These objects were organic in their geometry, massive flattened disks with a quality of deliberate biological intention, as though they had been grown rather than constructed. The largest of them, hanging at the center of the formation like a queen surrounded by attendants, was a scale that Vash's mind initially refused to process. His sensors told him it was roughly 500 kilometers in diameter. His instincts told him his sensors were malfunctioning. He ran the diagnostic twice. The sensors were not malfunctioning. 23 smaller craft orbited the central mass, each one still enormous by conventional standards, city-sized platforms that drifted with the patient, unhurried momentum of objects that had never needed to hurry. Around them, moving in fast coordinated sweeps like antibodies patrolling a bloodstream, were hundreds of smaller craft. Angular, predatory shapes. Attack craft, his tactical officer said quietly, with the specific tone of voice a person uses when they are providing information they wish they did not have. Vash opened a channel. He transmitted the standard Imperial identification hail on all frequencies, followed by the formal demand for vessel identification and statement of intent required by Imperial Navigation Law Article 7, Section 3. He waited the regulation 30 seconds. He transmitted again. He waited again. The formation continued its advance without acknowledging him. He noted this in his log with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that what he wrote here would be read by people with considerably more rank and considerably less patience for nuance. Unknown vessel formation, he wrote. Estimated 400 craft of varying scale. Central object approximately 500 kilometers diameter. No response to standard hails. Trajectory, inward. Toward the core. He did not write what he was thinking, which was that the formation moved with the specific confidence of something that had done this before. Many times before. That there was no hesitation in its advance, no sensor sweep pause that might indicate curiosity about the small Imperial patrol vessel sitting directly in its path. The Iron Meridian was, to whatever inhabited those ships, apparently not worth the energy of acknowledgment. That thought. The thought that something in this galaxy considered an Imperial warship beneath notice, was the most unsettling thing Vash had experienced in 14 years of service. He pulled the Iron Meridian out of the formation's path and watched it pass. Then he sent his report up the chain of command, flagged urgent, and settled in to wait for a response. The response came 6 hours later from Sector Command. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence thanked him for his diligence. The second sentence informed him that the objects he had detected were most likely a previously uncatalogued deep space nomadic convoy and that his threat assessment was, quote, characteristically overcautious. The third sentence reminded him that his patrol route had deviated from its assigned corridor and that a formal notation would be added to his service record. Vash read the response twice. He looked at his sensor logs. He looked at the trajectory line his navigation officer had plotted. A clean, undeviating arc that, if extended forward, pointed directly at the heart of the mid-rim. He filed a second report. He did not expect a different answer. He did not get one. The TIE fighters launched at 0400 station time, 16 craft screaming out of the Ardent Conviction's hangar bays in 2 precise columns, their twin ion engines leaving twin blue contrails against the absolute black of deep space. Lieutenant Commander Darasenis led the formation from her command TIE, her gloved hands moving across the controls with the practiced ease of a pilot who had logged more than 3,000 flight hours and survived engagements against Rebel X-Wings, Y-Wings, and the occasional Mon Calamari cruiser escort that thought it could trade punches with Imperial fighter doctrine. She had 43 confirmed kills. She had never lost a wingman she did not later avenge. Her squadron, Scythe Squadron, had the highest combat efficiency rating in the Siswena sector for 3 consecutive evaluation cycles. She had been briefed on the contact report filed by Commander Vash of the Iron Meridian 48 hours prior. She had read it twice, noted the sensor data attached as supplementary files, and arrived at the same conclusion that Sector Command had arrived at, though she arrived there by a different route. Sector Command had dismissed Vash's report because dismissing inconvenient reports was institutionally comfortable. Senis had set it aside because in her experience, unknown contacts in the Outer Rim were almost never as dramatic as the officer who filed the report believed them to be. Space was full of strange sensor returns. Gas clouds, dark matter concentrations, derelict colony ships drifting on ancient trajectories, the occasional massive creature from one of the deeper and stranger corners of the galaxy's biological catalog. Whatever Vash had seen, she was confident that 16 TIE fighters would be more than sufficient to establish contact, demonstrate Imperial authority, and send whatever nomadic convoy or wandering freighter fleet had stumbled into restricted space back in the direction it had come from. The Ardent Conviction, an Imperial-class Star Destroyer operating as the sector's rapid response asset, had brought them to within engagement range and then held position at a distance of 12,000 kilometers. Captain Orvin Drast, commanding the Conviction, had deployed Scythe Squadron as a forward probe, gather visual confirmation, attempt communication, assess the situation, and report back before any heavier response was authorized. Standard procedure. Sensible procedure. The kind of procedure that had been written by people who understood that Star Destroyers were expensive and TIE fighters were considerably less so. Senis brought the formation up to attack speed as the contacts resolved on her cockpit display. The sensor picture was cleaner at close range than Vash's report had suggested, and for a moment she felt the first genuine stirring of something she did not immediately want to name. The shapes ahead of her were not freighters. They were not colony ships. They were not anything in her considerable mental catalog of known vessel types. They were enormous and dark and geometrically deliberate, moving with a slow massive confidence that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the way a predator moved when it was not yet aware it was being watched. She counted the smaller craft first. 112 visible on her display, clustered in groups around the larger platform vessels, moving in patrol patterns that her tactical instinct recognized immediately as defensive screens. Not random drift. Coordinated coverage. Whatever these things were, they had military doctrine. They understood the concept of perimeter defense. She noted this and filed it away and kept her voice completely level when she opened the squadron channel. Scythe lead to all flight elements. We have visual confirmation on the contact cluster. Hold formation. I am attempting communication. She switched to the broad-spectrum hail frequency and transmitted the standard Imperial identification sequence, the same sequence Vash had transmitted 48 hours earlier with no response. She gave it 15 seconds. She transmitted again on a lower frequency band, then a higher one, then swept through the full range of subspace communication channels in a 10-second automated burst. The silence that came back was not the silence of a vessel that had not heard her. It was the silence of a vessel that had heard her perfectly and had made a decision about what her transmission was worth. The attack craft came off their patrol patterns with a coordination that was almost beautiful in its precision. Not all of them. 47 of the smaller vessels broke from their defensive clusters simultaneously, accelerating toward Scythe Squadron in a formation that her combat computer took 3 full seconds to analyze, 3 seconds being approximately 2.5 seconds longer than it normally needed to classify an incoming threat. The craft were angular and aggressive in their geometry, roughly half the size of a TIE fighter, with a forward profile that suggested the entire nose section was a weapon system. They moved with a speed that was, she noted with professional detachment, roughly comparable to a TIE interceptor at full military thrust. Scythe lead to conviction. We have incoming. 47 craft, attack profile. Requesting rules of engagement clarification. Captain Drast's voice came back in 4 seconds. Scythe lead, you are authorized to defend yourselves. Do not escalate. Attempt to disable rather than destroy if possible. Attempt to disable rather than destroy. She filed that instruction in the same mental compartment she filed all instructions that sounded reasonable from 12,000 kilometers away and considerably less reasonable from the cockpit of a TIE fighter with 47 unknown attack craft closing at combat speed. She broke the squadron into 2 8-ship elements, kept herself and 1 wingman as a command pair, and called the intercept. The first exchange lasted 19 seconds. In those 19 seconds, Senes learned several things that she would spend the rest of the engagement trying to process. The Harvester attack craft, she had no other name for them yet, would never have a name for them until the intelligence briefings came later, and by then the name would feel inadequate, were fast, maneuverable, and aggressive in their tactics in a way that suggested genuine tactical intelligence rather than programmed attack patterns. They did not fly in straight lines. They did not commit to attack runs and hold them regardless of incoming fire. They broke, adapted, covered each other, and responded to Scythe Squadron's movements with a fluidity that she had previously only encountered fighting the best rebel pilots the Alliance had to offer. Her first firing pass with her chin-mounted laser cannons tracked clean and she watched the bright lances of coherent light reach the lead Harvester craft and do nothing. Not nothing in the sense of a miss. The bolts struck the craft directly, center mass, and were absorbed. A faint shimmer of energy, barely visible at combat speed, and then nothing. The craft continued its attack run as though she had thrown a handful of gravel at a durasteel wall. Scythe lead, I have no effect on target. Repeat, direct hits, no effect. They have shielding of some kind. The responses from her pilots came in overlapping bursts as the same realization hit the rest of the squadron simultaneously. Hits were registering. Damage was not occurring. The Harvester craft were operating behind an energy screen that Imperial laser cannon fire was not penetrating, and the tactical problem this created was not a small one. TIE fighters carried no ordnance other than their laser cannons. They were designed around the doctrine of overwhelming numbers and precise gunnery, not around the contingency of fighting an enemy whose shields were impervious to their primary weapon system. She had time to process this problem for approximately 3 seconds before the harvester craft opened fire. The energy discharge from their weapons was unlike anything in her experience. Not the focused coherent bolts of turbolasers or blasters, not the ion wash of an ion cannon, not even the diffuse energy spread of a plasma weapon. It was a concentrated green-white beam of something her instruments classified, uselessly, as unrecognized energy type, and when it hit Scythe 9. Petty Officer David Sorar, 22 years old, 11 months out of the Prefsbelt Naval Academy, 61 flight hours in a combat tie, it did not punch through his hull or overload his shields. His TIE fighter simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed in the conventional sense of explosion and debris. Vaporized. The energy signature spiked on her display and then Sorar's transponder signal was gone as though it had never been there at all. The next 4 seconds cost her 3 more pilots. Scythe 12, Scythe 7, and Scythe 3 died in the same manner, a flash of that terrible green-white energy, a transponder signal gone silent, nothing left to mark the space where a human being in 20,000 credits of Imperial engineering had been. She was pulling her command pair into a hard brake, throwing every evasive maneuver in her considerable repertoire at the pursuit craft on her tail, when she made the decision that would be the subject of 3 separate after-action review boards and 1 informal inquiry from Sector Command's Intelligence Division. She broke off the engagement. All Scythe elements, disengage. I say again, disengage. Form on my position and accelerate to emergency speed toward the conviction. We are leaving. 3 pilots questioned the order. 2 of those 3 pilots died in the process of questioning it, still turning back toward the enemy when the green-white beams found them. The 3rd heard what was happening to his squad mates and accelerated toward Senis without another word. She brought 8 fighters home out of 16. 8 pilots who had launched with her 2 hours ago, supremely confident in their training and their technology and the institutional weight of the Galactic Empire standing behind them. 8 survivors who had learned something that no briefing document, no intelligence assessment, and no dismissive sector command response to a worried patrol commander's report had prepared them for. The Harvester's shields did not respond to Imperial weapons. The Harvester's weapons did not leave debris. And the Harvesters, as Senis pulled her battered formation into the Ardent Conviction's hangar bay and sat for a long moment in her cockpit before she could make herself move, had not broken off their advance by so much as a single degree. They had dispatched 47 craft to deal with 16 TIE fighters, absorbed the engagement as though it were a minor administrative inconvenience, recalled their attack craft back to their patrol patterns, and continued moving inward. Toward the core. She filed her after-action report with hands that she did not allow herself to notice were not entirely steady. She used precise language and specific sensor data and avoided the word that kept presenting itself to her as she wrote, the word that a 14-year veteran of Imperial service was not supposed to put in an official report because it implied a conclusion that the Empire's entire institutional identity was built to reject. She submitted the report without that word. She thought it anyway. Unstoppable. The report reached Moff Quillen Brecht's desk on Ariadu at 1100 hours, routed through 4 intermediate command layers that had each added their own annotations, qualifications, and bureaucratic cushioning to Lieutenant Commander Senis's raw after-action data. By the time it arrived at Brecht's desk it had accumulated 11 pages of supplementary commentary, 3 separate requests for additional sensor verification, 1 formal notation questioning Senis's judgment in withdrawing from the engagement, and a cover summary written by Admiral Tevrin Holst that characterized the incident as, quote, a preliminary contact with an unknown but likely manageable threat profile requiring measured response and further assessment before escalation to MOF-level attention. Brecht read Admiral Holst's summary first, as protocol dictated. Then he read the actual after-action report, which Senis had written with the specific clipped precision of a pilot who knew her words would be filtered through layers of institutional interpretation and had therefore stripped them of everything except measurable, verifiable fact. Direct laser cannon hits producing 0 hull damage. Energy weapon discharge vaporizing 4 TIE fighters in under 5 seconds with no recoverable debris. Harvester formation maintaining original course and speed throughout the engagement without deviation. He read it twice. He pulled up the raw sensor data attached as supplementary files and looked at the energy readings from the harvester weapon's discharge, the flat unresponsive line where Scythe 9's transponder should have shown impact damage and instead showed absolute signal termination. He sat with that sensor data for a long time. Quillen Brecht had served the Empire for 26 years. He had been a junior tactical officer during the final campaigns of the Clone Wars, had watched the Republic transform into the Empire with the particular clarity of a man who understood that the machinery of power did not change its essential nature simply because the nameplate above the door was replaced. He had risen through the ranks not through brilliance or political maneuvering. Though he possessed adequate quantities of both, but through a quality that was considerably rarer in Imperial service and considerably less celebrated, he was genuinely, constitutionally incapable of lying to himself about what he was looking at. What he was looking at was a problem. Not the kind of problem that additional tonnage solved. Not the kind of problem that could be addressed by deploying a Star Destroyer task force and issuing a formal ultimatum backed by the implicit threat of orbital bombardment. Those solutions worked on problems that understood the language of Imperial power, and the harvesters. He had read Seniz's physical description of the craft carefully, had noted her observation that they moved with the confidence of something that had done this before, many times, and found it deeply unpleasant. The harvesters did not appear to speak that language. Or rather, they appeared to speak it fluently and to have concluded that they had nothing to fear from it. He summoned Admiral Holst to his office at 1300 hours. Holst arrived with the bearing of a man who had already composed his talking points and was confident in them. He was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that communicated authority by default, strong jaw, steady eyes, the particular set of the mouth that senior Imperial officers cultivated over years of giving orders that were not questioned. He had commanded 3 Star Destroyers before his promotion to the Admiralty. He had never lost a ship to enemy action. He had a justified reputation as a competent, thorough, and profoundly conventional military mind, which meant he was excellent at winning the kinds of wars the Empire had already fought and potentially catastrophic at recognizing the kinds of wars it had not. "Admiral," Brecht said, without preamble, "I want you to look at something." He turned his display toward Holst and brought up the sensor graph showing the energy readings from the moment Scythe 9's transponder went dark. The line that should have shown a hit, a systems cascade, a hull breach, an ejection signal, any of the dozen different signatures that indicated a fighter had been damaged or destroyed, and instead showed a single spike of unclassified energy followed by absolute nothing. Holst looked at it. His expression did not change. "Powerful weapon system," he said. "We've encountered powerful weapon systems before." "The fighter didn't explode," Brecht said. "There's no debris field. There's no radiation scatter consistent with a reactor breach. The craft and its pilot were converted to energy in approximately 1.3 seconds. Which tells us their weapons are advanced," Holst said, with the tone of a man conceding a minor point in a larger argument he expected to win. "It doesn't tell us their weapons are insurmountable. A single TIE squadron encountering an unknown threat and withdrawing under fire is not a data set sufficient to draw strategic conclusions. Seniz is a capable pilot. She's also a pilot who lost 8 of her people in a first contact engagement and filed her report within 2 hours of landing. There's an emotional component to consider." Brecht looked at Holst for a moment without speaking. It was a particular kind of silence that Holst, to his credit, recognized, shifting slightly in his chair in a way that suggested some part of him understood he had said something that was going to be referenced later. "The emotional component," Brecht said carefully, "is that 8 Imperial pilots are dead and there is no physical evidence they ever existed. I'm less concerned with Lieutenant Commander Seniz's emotional state than I am with the fact that their shields did not respond to direct laser cannon fire at close range. At all. Not reduced effectiveness. Not partial penetration. Zero response. We've encountered shielding technologies that required frequency modulation before," Holst said. "The rebels developed The rebels developed shields that required adjusted firing solutions, Brecht said. This is different. Look at the energy absorption curve. He pulled up a second graph, the sensor reading from the moment Seniz's cannon bolt struck the lead harvester craft. The line showing the bolt's energy simply stopped. No reflection, no diffusion, no absorption spike followed by degradation. It stopped as though the energy had been redirected somewhere else entirely. Their shields aren't deflecting our weapons' fire. They're consuming it. Whatever technology is generating that screen, it is not related to any deflector shield principle in our engineering database. Holst looked at the graph. For the first time, something shifted slightly in his expression, not alarm, not yet, but the specific flicker of a man whose internal model of a situation is encountering data that doesn't fit and is deciding whether to update the model or reject the data. He chose, as Brecht had expected he would, to negotiate with the data rather than accept it. One squadron engagement, Holst said. Against a forward screen of their attack craft. We don't know what their shielding looks like under sustained turbolaser fire from a capital ship. We don't know if their city-scale vessels carry the same shielding as their fighters. We don't know their strategic objectives, their command structure, their resource limitations, or whether they're even aware that they've entered Imperial space rather than, say, wild space they consider unclaimed. He straightened slightly. What I am recommending is a measured response. 1-star destroyer. The Relentless is the closest available capital ship of appropriate class. Deploy it to the contact zone, establish a communication perimeter, and if communication continues to fail, demonstrate the kind of firepower that makes communication suddenly seem attractive. Brecht was quiet for a moment. Outside his office window, Ariadu's industrial skyline stretched toward a gray sky, the planet's refineries and processing facilities running their endless cycles, the machinery of imperial economic infrastructure operating with the smooth indifference of a system that had never been asked to consider its own vulnerability. And if the Relentless achieves the same result as Scythe Squadron, he asked. Then we deploy 2-star destroyers, Holst said, with the absolute confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that more star destroyers had failed to solve. Brecht looked at him for a long time. He thought about Seniz's report, the specific word she had not used, the word that a 14-year veteran of Imperial service would not put in an official document. He thought about the trajectory line his navigation officer had plotted from the formation's current position, the clean undeviating arc pointing toward the mid-rim, then the core. He thought about 26 years of Imperial service and the particular institutional disease that ran through the Empire's command structure like a fault line through bedrock, invisible until the moment the ground moved and by then too late to do anything except fall. He approved the deployment of the Relentless. He told himself it was because Holst was right that one squadron engagement was insufficient data. He told himself it was because the chain of command existed for reasons and that circumventing it based on a feeling, even a feeling backed by sensor data that he could not stop thinking about, was not how sound strategic decisions were made. He told himself these things with the practiced fluency of a man who had spent 26 years in a system that rewarded the telling of comfortable institutional stories. He submitted the deployment order and copied it to Coruscant as protocol required, flagged for review at the appropriate administrative level, which meant it would sit in a queue for between 6 and 12 hours before a junior analyst in the Naval Operations Directorate even opened the file. He did not flag it urgent. He would spend a considerable amount of time thinking about that decision later. About the specific moment when he had moved his hand toward the priority classification field on his terminal and then moved it away again, and what that small, almost unconscious withdrawal had cost, and whether the weight of it was something a man could carry for the rest of whatever years remained to him. But that was later. Right now, the Relentless was already moving. The ISD Relentless dropped out of hyperspace at 0630 hours, 40,000 kilometers from the leading edge of the Harvester formation, and for approximately 90 seconds it was the most magnificent thing in that sector of space. It was 1,600 meters of Imperial engineering at its most absolute and deliberate, a dagger-shaped monument to the principle that overwhelming force, concentrated and precisely applied, was the galaxy's most honest and enduring argument. Its hull bristled with 60 turbolaser batteries, 60 ion cannons, and 10 tractor beam projectors. Its hangar bays carried 2 full TIE fighter wings. Its deflector shields could absorb sustained turbolaser fire from 3 rebel cruisers simultaneously without requiring the crew to interrupt their lunch. It massed, fully loaded with crew and ordnance and fuel and the 10,000 other components that made a Star Destroyer a self-contained instrument of Imperial dominion, approximately 40 million metric tons. Captain Ferris Aldrich stood on the relentless command bridge and looked at what his forward viewport was showing him and felt, briefly and without any intention of allowing the feeling to register on his face, something he had not felt in the 17 years since he had taken command of his first vessel. He felt small. The Harvester formation had not altered course at the relentless arrival. It had not slowed. It had not accelerated. It had not, as far as his sensor officer could determine, done anything that indicated it had registered the presence of an Imperial Star Destroyer materializing 40,000 kilometers off its forward flank as a fact worthy of response. The central mothership, 500 kilometers in diameter, a number his mind continued to refuse to process with the ease it processed other large numbers. Hung at the center of its attendant city destroyers with the absolute patience of something that measured time in a different denomination than years or decades. The city destroyers themselves, each one between 15 and 20 kilometers across, drifted in their formation like dark continents, their undersides carrying the focused energy projector arrays that Seniza's report had flagged as primary offensive systems. Around the larger vessels, the attack craft continued their patrol sweeps. Hundreds of them. Moving in their fluid, organic coordination, covering their assigned sectors with the thoroughness of a system that had been refined over a span of time that Aldrich did not want to contemplate. He gave the standard Imperial hail. He gave it 3 times, on all frequencies, with the full weight of Imperial legal authority behind it: identify yourself, state your intentions, heave to for inspection, acknowledge. The silence that came back was the same silence Vash had received, the same silence Senis had received. Not the silence of parties who had not heard. The silence of parties who had heard and were not interested in the conversation being offered. Aldrich straightened slightly and clasped his hands behind his back. Tactical, he said, I want a firing solution on the lead city destroyer. Primary turbolaser batteries, full convergence spread. Target their propulsion signature. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Pren Valos, worked his station for 11 seconds and then reported that the firing solution was ready. Hold, Aldrich said. He waited. He was giving the formation one final opportunity to register that an Imperial Star Destroyer had targeting solutions locked on one of its component vessels and to make the rational decision that this represented. Every adversary the Relentless had faced in 17 years of service had, at this point in the sequence, made the rational decision. The rebels who had tried to run blockades had cut their engines and raised their hands. The pirate fleets who had thought that numbers compensated for firepower differential had broken and scattered. Even the occasional rogue Hutt fleet, bloated with criminal confidence and hired muscle, had ultimately looked at 1,600 meters of Star Destroyer hanging in space with its turbolaser batteries at full charge and concluded that discretion was the more profitable option. The Harvester formation continued its advance without deviation. Fire, Aldrich said. The Relentless opened up with 32 of its primary turbolaser batteries in a coordinated salvo that lit up the sector like a small star going through a brief and violent phase change. The energy output of that opening salvo was sufficient, by the Relentless' own weapon specification documentation, to reduce a medium-sized city to a smoking crater in approximately 4.7 seconds. The bolts crossed the 40,000-kilometer gap in fractions of a second and struck the lead city destroyer across its forward face in a pattern that Valos had designed to maximize structural stress across the widest possible area. The city destroyer's shields absorbed the salvo. Not deflected. Not partially penetrated with residual hull damage. Absorbed. The energy screen surrounding the vessel flared a deep blue-white at the impact points, a visible shimmer that spread across the shield boundary like ripples across the surface of a disturbed lake, and then settled back to invisibility as the energy was processed and dissipated by whatever mechanism the harvesters used to maintain their defensive technology. The city destroyer's hull, beneath that shield, was unmarked. Its trajectory was unchanged. Its speed was unchanged. The silence on the relentless bridge lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in the context of an active combat engagement was a very long time. "Tactical," Aldrich said, with a steadiness in his voice that would later be cited in his posthumous service commendation as evidence of exceptional command composure under pressure, "full turbolaser complement. All batteries. Continuous fire." The Relentless opened up with everything it had. What followed was, from a purely visual standpoint, extraordinary. 60 turbolaser batteries firing at sustained maximum output produced an energy discharge that was visible to the naked eye from a considerable distance, a continuous storm of coherent light pouring from the Star Destroyer's flanks and converging on the City Destroyer in an unrelenting cascade. The shield flared continuously, a rolling aurora of blue-white energy that spread and shifted and contracted as the bombardment pushed it through its adaptive cycles. For 47 seconds, the Relentless poured everything its weapons systems were capable of producing into that shield, and Aldrich stood on his bridge and watched his sensor officers display with the focused attention of a man looking for the number that would tell him his weapons were working. The number did not come. At 47 seconds, a reading on Valos's display shifted. Not the shield integrity reading of the City Destroyer, which remained stubbornly, impossibly stable. A different reading. The energy absorption curve that the City Destroyer's shields were producing had changed character, flattened slightly, shifted frequency. In a way that Valos flagged immediately because he was a thorough and precise tactical officer and because something in the way the curve had changed reminded him, unpleasantly, of a system that had finished processing incoming data and was preparing to do something with the conclusions it had reached. "Sir," Valos said, "their shield is." The City Destroyer fired. The focused energy beam that emerged from the projector array on its underside was not green-white like the attack craft weapons. It was a deep and terrible violet, thick as a starship's drive column, and it did not move the way turbolaser bolts moved, in discrete coherent pulses with a measurable travel time. It moved the way light moved. It arrived at the Relentless at the speed of physics itself, and it struck the Star Destroyer's ventral shield at a point roughly midships, and what happened next was something that the 312 crew members who survived would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and failing. The shield held for 2.1 seconds. In those 2.1 seconds the Relentless shield generators were operating at 114% of rated capacity, a number that was not supposed to be achievable and that the engineering team in the lower decks achieved by rerouting power from systems that were not supposed to be reroutable. Chief Engineer Marta Sovereign later said, in her survivor's deposition, that she had never seen a shield generator work that hard and that she had understood in those 2.1 seconds that it was not going to be enough and that she had started moving her damage control teams toward the blast compartments before the shield failed because she was an engineer who understood what the numbers were telling her. The shield failed at 2.1 seconds. The beam continued for another 4 seconds after that. What it did to the Relentless in those 4 seconds was not destruction in the conventional sense of hull breach and compartment decompression and the cascading system's failures that turned a warship into debris over the course of minutes or hours. It was more immediate and more absolute than that. The beam traveled through the Relentless midsection along a path that corresponded roughly to the ship's main power conduit trunk, and everything that path intersected, durasteel, electronics, coolant lines, the bodies of crew members who happened to be in the wrong corridor at the wrong moment, was converted to the same undifferentiated energy state that Seniza's sensor data had shown when Scythe 9's transponder went dark. The Relentless broke in two. The forward section, carrying the bridge and the command crew and Captain Aldrich with his hands still clasped behind his back and his voice still steady, tumbled slowly away from the point of impact. The aft section, carrying the main drives and the engineering spaces and Chief Engineer Sovereign's damage control teams, tumbled in the opposite direction. Both sections were structurally intact for approximately 11 seconds before the chain reaction of uncontrolled power conduit failures that resulted from the sudden severing of the ship's primary system's backbone propagated through both halves simultaneously, and the Relentless became, in the span of a breath, a rapidly expanding field of superheated gas and cooling metal fragments. 312 crew members survived. They survived because they were in the two starboard hangar bays when the beam hit, and the hangar bays were on the opposite side of the ship from the impact point, and their TIE fighters and the hangar's emergency pressure doors gave them a survivable bubble in the expanding debris field long enough for the emergency beacon signals to register on the Ardent Conviction's long-range sensors 40,000 kilometers away. The Harvester formation did not stop to observe the wreckage. It did not slow. It did not accelerate. The city destroyer that had fired did not power down its projector array with anything that might be interpreted as satisfaction or acknowledgment of what it had just done. The patrol craft continued their sweeps. The mothership continued its vast patient advance. The formation moved through the space where the Relentless had been with the same unhurried momentum it had maintained since Vash had first spotted it at the edge of Imperial space, and the debris field parted around the leading edges of the city destroyers and closed again behind them, and the sector was quiet. On Ariadu, at 1847 hours, Moff Brecht received the notification that the Relentless had been destroyed with the loss of most of its crew. He read the sensor data from the Ardent Conviction, which had been close enough to record the engagement in full and distant enough to survive it. He read the energy readings from the city destroyer's primary weapon. He read the shield absorption data from the 47 seconds of sustained turbolaser fire that had produced zero hull damage on the target vessel. He sat for a long time without moving. Then he reached for his terminal and composed a message to Coruscant. This time, he flagged it urgent. This time, he did not qualify his language or cushion his conclusions with the bureaucratic padding that made difficult information easier for senior officials to receive. He wrote what Senis had not written, the word she had kept out of her official report, the word he had been turning over in his mind since he had first looked at her sensor data and felt the specific chill of a man whose institutional certainties were beginning to crack. He wrote it now because the Relentless was gone and 23,000 crew members were dead and the formation was still moving and there was no longer any professional advantage to be gained from pretending otherwise. He flagged the message for immediate delivery to Imperial Center and copied it personally to Lord Vader's command ship, because Brecht had spent 26 years in the Empire's service and he understood, with a clarity that had come too late but had come, that there was only one node in the Imperial command structure that was capable of receiving this kind of information and responding to it without first running it through the institutional filters that had already cost them a star destroyer. And a patrol ship and 24 TIE fighters and more time than they could afford to lose. The message was 4 sentences long. The Relentless has been destroyed. Total crew loss. Enemy shielding is impervious to sustained capital ship turbolaser fire. I am requesting immediate Vader-level response authorization and classification of this contact as an extinction-level threat. He sent it. He did not expect to still be Moff by morning. He sent it anyway. The message reached Darth Vader at 2,100 hours aboard the Devastator, currently stationed in the Outer Rim pursuing a rebel cell that had been raiding Imperial supply convoys along the Hydian Way. Vader read it standing at the center of his private meditation chamber, the curved black walls of the pressurized sphere sealing out the ambient noise of the ship around him, leaving only the rhythmic mechanical breath that marked the seconds of his existence with the patience of a metronome that had never once missed a beat in 19 years. He read it twice. Not because the content required 2 readings to be understood. The content was unambiguous and Brecht had written it with the blunt economy of a man who had stopped caring about his career and started caring about something more fundamental. Vader read it twice because the first reading produced a response in him that he spent the second reading examining with the cool detachment that 2 decades of Sith discipline had made his most reliable tool. The response was not alarm. It was not the strategic assessment process that his military experience initiated automatically when new threat data arrived. It was something older and more instinctive than either of those things, something that lived below the level of conscious thought in whatever part of him still operated on purely biological terms despite everything that had been done to his biology on Mustafar. It was recognition. Not of the harvesters specifically. He had no knowledge of them, no intelligence briefing that had ever mentioned a species matching Brecht's description, no entry in any imperial xenobiological catalog that corresponded to craft 500 kilometers in diameter moving through imperial space with the confidence of something that had reduced other civilizations to silence before this one. The recognition was not of the specific threat. It was of the category of threat. The shape of it. The way Brecht's 4 sentences described something that existed outside the parameters of the Empire's threat assessment framework, something that had looked at the most powerful conventional military force in the galaxy and registered it as a minor navigational obstacle. Vader had encountered things that existed outside parameters before. He was, in the estimation of most beings who had reason to think carefully about such questions, one of those things himself. He closed the meditation chamber and summoned Admiral Kendall Ozzel. Ozzel arrived in 4 minutes, which was faster than his usual response time and suggested that word of Brecht's message had already begun moving through the Devastator's command layer via the informal channels that existed in every military hierarchy regardless of how rigorously those channels were officially discouraged. He was a heavy-set man with the particular combination of self-importance and institutional anxiety that Vader had observed in senior Imperial officers often enough to have stopped finding it interesting. Ozzel was competent within his parameters in the way that most Imperial flag officers were competent within their parameters, reliable, methodical, and deeply, fundamentally committed to the belief that the parameters were sufficient. Lord Vader, Ozzel said, with the careful deference of a man who had spent enough time in Vader's presence to understand that the space between a calm Vader and an impatient Vader was narrower than it appeared and considerably less forgiving than he would prefer. "You have read Brecht's report," Vader said. It was not a question. A brief hesitation. The hesitation of a man deciding whether to pretend he hadn't. "I have been made aware of its general contents, my lord." "Then you are aware that a Star Destroyer has been destroyed with total crew loss by an unknown formation that has demonstrated immunity to sustained capital ship turbolaser fire." Vader turned from the viewport, where the star field of the outer rim stretched in its cold indifferent beauty, and looked at Ozzel with the expressionless black lenses that served as his eyes. "What is your assessment?" Ozzel's assessment, delivered over the next 90 seconds, was a masterpiece of institutional self-protection dressed in the language of strategic analysis. He acknowledged the seriousness of the relentless incident. He noted that a single engagement, even a catastrophic one, was not necessarily indicative of a systemic vulnerability in Imperial military doctrine. He suggested that the Relentless may have encountered a specific weapons configuration that exploited a known gap in Star Destroyer ventral shielding, a gap that could be addressed through tactical adjustment. He recommended deploying a task force of 3 Star Destroyers in a coordinated flanking pattern that would prevent the enemy from concentrating fire on a single vessel while allowing the task force to maintain sustained bombardment pressure across a wider shield surface area. He was, Vader reflected, describing the same mistake at 3 times the scale. Their shields absorbed 47 seconds of full turbolaser fire from a Star Destroyer without measurable degradation, Vader said. Deploying 3 Star Destroyers does not address the fundamental problem. It multiplies the firepower directed at a shield that has already demonstrated it does not respond to firepower. With respect, my lord, we don't yet know the upper threshold of their shielding capacity. It's possible that. It is possible, Vader said, with a quietness that caused Ozzel to stop speaking immediately, that you are attempting to apply a solution you are familiar with to a problem you do not yet understand. That is a habit which has ended the careers of better officers than yourself, Admiral, and in the present circumstances it has the potential to end considerably more than careers. Ozzel said nothing. His silence had the specific quality of a man who had arrived at the outer boundary of his professional confidence and discovered there was nothing beyond it. Vader turned back to the viewport. He was thinking about the Force, and about the specific way that the Force responded to the living galaxy around him, the vast web of connection and energy that bound every living thing into a tapestry he could feel as readily as other beings felt the air on their skin. He had navigated that tapestry for 19 years, using it as both weapon and compass, reaching through it to sense the presence of enemies before they were visible, to anticipate movements before they were made, to find the thread of intention in an opponent's mind and pull it apart before it became action. The harvesters, according to everything Brecht's report implied, had come from somewhere else. Not from the outer rim, not from the unknown regions. From somewhere genuinely, categorically elsewhere. And the question that Vader was turning over in the silence of his own mind, the question that his Sith training framed as a tactical problem and his deeper instinct framed as something more fundamental, was whether beings from that elsewhere had a presence in the Force. He reached out. It was not a physical gesture. It was an extension of awareness, a widening of the perceptual field that the Force gave him, casting outward through the hull of the Devastator and across the light years of space between his current position and the trajectory line that Brecht's report had plotted for the Harvester formation. He had done this before at distances that his Academy instructors would have said were impossible, feeling for the specific texture of living consciousness that the Force translated for him. The bright warm signatures of human and near-human minds, the cooler more diffuse presences of alien species, the particular resonance of Force-sensitive individuals that rang like a struck bell in his awareness regardless of the distance between them. He found nothing. Not the nothing of empty space, which had its own quality in the Force, a neutral absence, a baseline. This was a different kind of nothing. It was the nothing of a space where living things were present but were not registering in the Force in any way that he could detect. A blind spot. Not a void but a silence, a section of the Force's tapestry where the thread simply did not exist. As though whatever was moving through Imperial space toward the core was not alive in any sense that the Force recognized, or was alive in a sense so alien to the Force's framework that the connection between them was simply not there to be felt. He had encountered Force-dead beings before. The Yuuzhan Vong were a concept he knew from ancient Sith texts, beings from outside the galaxy who existed in the Force as absences rather than presences. The texts described them as deeply unsettling to Force users for precisely this reason, that the Force, which gave its practitioners an awareness of the living world that non-sensitives could not comprehend, became useless as a perceptual tool in their presence. You could not feel them coming. You could not read their intentions. You could not anticipate their movements. You fought them, if you fought them, with nothing but your physical senses and your training and whatever tactical intelligence your non-Force sensitive subordinates could provide. The Harvesters were not the Yuuzhan Vong. But they produced the same quality of absence in the Force, and Vader stood at his viewport and held that absence in his awareness and understood, with a clarity that cut through the institutional noise of Ozzel's task force recommendations and Brecht's careful four-sentence understatement, exactly what they were dealing with. They were dealing with an enemy against whom his greatest weapon was blind. He turned from the viewport and issued orders that moved with the speed and authority that only his name and his presence could produce in the Imperial command structure. The Devastator would redirect immediately to the Seswena sector. 3 additional Star Destroyers from the nearest available fleet elements would converge on his position en route. Moff Brecht's extinction-level classification would be formally endorsed and elevated to Imperial Center with Vader's personal authority behind it, which meant it would reach the Emperor's attention rather than sitting in an administrative queue waiting for a junior analyst to decide it merited escalation. And one additional order, issued quietly to his personal intelligence staff, which did not go through the Devastator's standard command channels and was not logged in the ship's official order record. An order to pull every piece of xenobiological, archaeological, and historical data in the Imperial archives that corresponded to the specific characteristics Brecht's report described. City-scale vessels, adaptive energy shielding, focused beam weapons that converted matter to energy, a formation structure suggesting a hive-based command intelligence, a trajectory of advance that implied a destination rather than an exploration. A species that had done this before. He wanted to know where they had done it before. He wanted to know what worlds they had visited prior to this one. He wanted to know what those worlds looked like afterward. He suspected he already knew the answer to that last question. The suspicion lived in the same place that the recognition had lived when he first read Brecht's message, below conscious thought, in the biological substrate that 19 years of Sith transformation had suppressed but never entirely eliminated. The part of him that had once been a 9-year-old boy on Tatooine looking up at the stars and feeling the galaxy's immensity as a promise rather than a threat. That part of him looked at the trajectory line on Brecht's report, the clean undeviating arc pointed at the core, at Coruscant, at the beating heart of everything the Empire had built, and did not see a military problem to be solved. It saw something coming that had come before, to other places, and understood with terrible simplicity what had been left of those places when the coming was done. Ozzel was still standing behind him, waiting. "Set course for the Saswena sector," Vader said. "Maximum speed." "Yes, my lord." "And the rebel cell on the Hydian Way?" Vader considered the rebel cell for approximately 1 second. The cell had been raiding supply convoys for 3 months. They were 17 operatives with 2 modified freighters and a safe house on a moon that Imperial intelligence had identified last week. They were, in the context of what was currently moving through Imperial space toward the core, a problem of such spectacular insignificance that the act of continuing to treat them as a priority felt like a form of institutional insanity. "They will keep," he said. The Hive did not think the way individual minds thought. This was not a limitation. It was, by any measure the Hive would have applied to the question had it been capable of the kind of self-reflective analysis that individual minds use to understand themselves, its most fundamental and defining advantage. Individual minds were sequential. They processed one thought, then another, moving through the landscape of a problem the way a single traveler moved through physical terrain. One step at a time, limited by the horizon of their own perception, capable of only one location at once. The Hive processed everything simultaneously. Every datum gathered by every unit in the formation was available to every other unit in the formation at the speed of the biological transmission network that connected them, a network that had been refined over a span of time that made the entire recorded history of the civilization currently occupying this galaxy look like an afternoon. The Hive had been doing this for a very long time. It had entered this galaxy through the same mechanism it had used to enter the others, a fold in the fabric of space that its technology had learned to locate and exploit with the precision of a surgeon working a familiar incision. The fold had deposited the formation at the galaxy's outer edge, in the sparse star systems that the civilization here called the Outer Rim, and the Hive had begun its assessment with the methodical patience that was one of the qualities individual minds tended to find most disturbing about it, when they had enough time remaining to find anything disturbing at all. Assessment was always the first phase. The Hive did not arrive in a new galaxy and immediately begin the harvest. That was not how the process worked. The process had been developed over iterations too numerous to count, refined through contact with civilizations that ranged from pre-technological species barely capable of interstellar thought to vast empire-spanning powers that had looked at the approaching formation with the same confidence this galaxy's dominant military force had displayed, and the process had been refined specifically because the Hive had learned, in its earliest iterations, that beginning the harvest without adequate assessment was wasteful, inefficient. The Hive found inefficiency genuinely intolerable in a way that was as close to an emotional response as its distributed consciousness ever produced. So it assessed. The patrol vessel that had held position in the formation's path for 40 minutes before withdrawing had been the first data point. Small craft, simple energy-based propulsion, directed energy communications using frequency bands that the Hive's analysis systems catalogued in approximately 8 seconds. The crew aboard it, the Hive's biological sensors had counted 6 distinct biosignatures, had transmitted a structured signal on multiple frequencies, which indicated a species that used sequential symbolic communication and expected other intelligent species to share that framework. The signal's mathematical structure was not complex. The Hive decoded its essential meaning in under a minute. It was an identification request combined with a territorial claim. The Hive filed this under behavioral pattern, territorial species, hierarchical command structure, communication-dependent coordination, and continued its advance. The fighter craft had been more informative. 16 small single-pilot vessels, extremely fast, maneuverable, carrying directed energy weapons of moderate power output. The pilots had demonstrated genuine tactical skill, their formation discipline was good, their response to the Hive's attack units had been adaptive rather than rigidly programmed, and the withdrawal decision made by their leader had been made at precisely the correct moment, which the Hive noted as evidence of a commanding intelligence capable of recognizing unfavorable odds and prioritizing unit preservation over engagement completion. This was a more sophisticated behavioral profile than many civilizations the Hive had assessed in its earlier iterations displayed at first contact. Many species, particularly those whose military power had gone unchallenged for long enough, exhibited what the Hive's analytical framework classified as threat blindness, an inability to recognize a genuinely superior threat because their reference frame contained no data point for defeat at the relevant scale. The fighter commander had not exhibited threat blindness. The Hive marked this as a data point of moderate interest and filed it accordingly. The large vessel had been the most informative contact of the assessment phase. The Hive had known the large vessel was coming before it arrived. The energy signature of its faster-than-light transition had been detectable 40 minutes before the transition completed, giving the Hive's analysis systems ample time to prepare its assessment protocols. The vessel was 1,600 meters in length, large by the standards of the civilization's military hardware, though modest by the Hive's own scale, and its weapons output during the engagement had been substantial. The Hive had allowed the engagement to proceed for 47 seconds of sustained fire specifically to gather complete data on the civilization's primary offensive technology. Directed energy weapons, coherent light-based, operating in the upper terawatt range at sustained maximum output. The shield systems the Hive had deployed for this assessment phase absorbed the output with a margin of approximately 63%. The shields had not been stressed. They had not required adaptive cycling. They had processed the incoming energy with the same effortless efficiency that the Hive's biological systems processed atmospheric gases, automatically, continuously, without diverting resources from any other function. When the assessment data was complete, the Hive had destroyed the vessel. Not because the vessel posed a threat. The vessel had not posed a threat at any point during the engagement, and the Hive's analysis systems had known this within the first 4 seconds of the turbolaser barrage. The Hive had destroyed it because its continued presence in the formation's path represented a navigation variable, because destruction was more efficient than sustained containment, and because the data gathered from the vessel's destruction, the specific structural failure cascade that followed the primary beam's impact, the energy release from the vessel's matter-antimatter power core as containment failed, the precise thermal and radiation signature of the resulting debris field, added several valuable data points to the Hive's understanding of this civilization's engineering principles. Understanding engineering principles was important. Not for this phase. For later phases. The Hive spent the next 18 hours in what an individual mind might have called contemplation, though the word was inadequate. Every unit in the formation. The mothership, the city destroyers, the thousands of attack craft, the biological processing systems running in the deep interior of the mothership's harvest chambers, was simultaneously engaged in integrating the assessment data and updating the operational model for this galaxy's civilization. The model was detailed and growing more detailed by the hour as the formation's passive sensor arrays gathered continuous data from the civilization's communication frequencies, its faster-than-light transit signatures, its navigational beacon network, and the electromagnetic leakage from its inhabited worlds and stations that painted a picture of its extent and distribution as clearly as a map drawn by hand. The civilization was large. Larger than many the Hive had assessed, though not the largest. It occupied a significant portion of a spiral galaxy with a dense core cluster of heavily populated worlds surrounded by progressively less densely inhabited spiral arms. Its faster-than-light technology was sophisticated. The specific method it used to fold space for transit was different from any the Hive had previously encountered, operating on principles that the Hive's engineering analysis systems classified as novel and filed for detailed study. Its communication network was fast and extensive. Its military infrastructure was substantial and distributed across multiple fleet concentrations, with the largest concentration appearing to be stationed near the galaxy's core. The Hive noted all of this with the equanimity of an entity that had assessed large civilizations before and understood that scale was not a meaningful variable when the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement was as complete as the 47-second turbolaser barrage had confirmed it to be. What the Hive found genuinely interesting. The word was approximate, the Hive's analytical response to novel data being something that individual minds would have called interest but which lacked the emotional coloring that word implied, was something it had not encountered in previous assessment phases. Something that its sensor arrays had been detecting since the formation entered this galaxy and that its analysis systems had been attempting to classify ever since. There was an energy field permeating this galaxy that the Hive had no prior record of. It was not electromagnetic. It was not gravitational. It was not any of the fundamental forces that the Hive's extensive scientific framework recognized and catalogued. It was something else. A field of some kind, low intensity and omnipresent, woven through the fabric of space itself the way gravity was woven through the fabric of space itself, but operating on principles that the Hive's analysis systems could detect but could not yet explain. The field appeared to interact with biological organisms in ways that produced measurable effects. Certain individuals among the civilization's population showed elevated interaction with the field, a coupling between their biological systems and the field structure that produced effects the Hive's sensors registered as anomalous without being able to fully classify. The large vessel that had been destroyed had contained several individuals with this elevated field coupling. The Hive had registered their biosignatures during the engagement and noted the field interaction before the vessel's destruction had ended the data stream. One of the field-coupled individuals had been on the vessel's command bridge. Another had been in the engineering section. Their field interaction profiles had been notably different from each other and from the rest of the crew, in ways that the Hive's analysis systems were still processing. Now, 18 hours after the Relentless had ceased to exist, the Hive's passive sensor arrays were detecting something new. A vessel approaching from the direction of the outer rim, moving at high speed, its faster-than-light transition signature indicating a mass consistent with another large military craft of the same class as the destroyed vessel. The approach trajectory and speed were consistent with an interdiction mission. The Hive classified this as an expected response given the destroyed vessel's data and the communication traffic it had been monitoring since the engagement. But the new vessel's biosignature profile contained something that the Hive's analysis systems flagged immediately and elevated to priority processing status. Aboard the approaching vessel was a biological entity whose interaction with the pervasive energy field was not merely elevated. It was, by a considerable margin, the most intense field coupling the Hive had detected in any individual organism since entering this galaxy. The entity's biosignature was partially artificial. Significant portions of its biological systems had been replaced or augmented with mechanical components, in a pattern that the Hive's medical analysis systems recognized as trauma response reconstruction rather than elective enhancement. But beneath the mechanical augmentation, the biological substrate was interacting with the field at a level that the Hive sensors could not find an adequate comparative reference for. The Hive did not experience anticipation. But something in its distributed analytical processing shifted when it registered that biosignature, the way a vast calculation shifts when a new variable is introduced that changes the shape of the solution space. It adjusted two of its city destroyers' trajectories by a fraction of a degree. Not enough to alter the formation's overall advance. Enough to ensure that when the approaching vessel arrived at engagement range, those two city destroyers would be optimally positioned. The Hive had assessed this civilization's conventional military technology thoroughly. It had not yet assessed what the field-coupled entities were capable of. It intended to. The Devastator dropped out of hyperspace at 0300 hours into a sector that felt wrong before a single sensor reading confirmed it. Vader felt at the moment the ship completed its transition, a pressure against his force awareness that was unlike anything in his considerable catalog of battlefield experiences. Not the absence he had reached out to feel from the Devastator's bridge 2 days ago, though that absence was still there, still present in the force like a blind spot in vision, a region of the perceptual field that simply returned nothing when the mind's eye turned toward it. This was different. The absence, at distance, had been a neutral thing, disturbing in its implications but not in itself carrying any quality beyond the fact of its existence. Here, at close range, with the Harvester formation visible on the forward viewport as a cluster of vast dark geometries against the star field, the absence had weight. It pressed against his awareness the way total darkness pressed against physical eyes. Not painful, but fundamentally disorienting in a way that no amount of training entirely prepared a person for, because the preparation assumed the existence of the sense being disrupted and there was no preparation adequate for the experience of a sense simply not working. He stood on the Devastator's bridge and looked at the formation and reached into the force and found nothing. Not the warm complex tapestry of living consciousness that the force normally gave him when he approached an inhabited vessel or a populated world. Not even the cooler, simpler signatures of non-sentient biological life. Nothing. The formation ahead of him, carrying, by any biological assessment, thousands or perhaps millions of living organisms of whatever kind the Harvesters were, registered in the force as empty space. As vacuum. As the absence of life rather than its presence, despite everything his physical senses and his sensor displays were telling him about the biological activity radiating from those vast dark ships. He had read the Sith texts about the Yuuzhan Vong carefully on the journey here. He had read them not because he expected the Harvesters to be Yuuzhan Vong. The descriptions did not match, the vessel profiles did not match, the tactical behavior did not match. But because the Yuuzhan Vong represented the only conceptual framework in any document he had access to for what it meant to fight an enemy the Force could not see. The texts had been written by Sith Lords who had encountered Vong advanced scouts in the unknown regions centuries before the main invasion that the texts predicted had materialized, and the Sith Lords had been, by their own accounts, profoundly shaken. Not by the Vong's military capability, which was formidable but not insurmountable. By the experience of fighting without the Force's guidance, which those ancient Sith Lords described in language that Vader, reading it, found uncomfortably resonant. To fight without the Force is to fight blind, one text said. Not merely without one sense among many, but without the sense that makes all other senses meaningful. A Jedi stripped of Force awareness is not a diminished warrior. He is a different kind of warrior entirely, and whether that different kind is capable of surviving depends entirely on what he has built in himself beneath the Force's gifts. Vader had spent 19 years building himself almost entirely around the Force's gifts. He stood at the viewport and held this problem in his mind with the cold analytical discipline that was his most reliable tool and examined it from multiple angles simultaneously. The Force was not available as a tactical instrument against the Harvesters. This was a fixed constraint, not a variable. Working around fixed constraints was a problem with a finite solution space, and finite solution spaces, however unpleasant, were preferable to infinite ones because they could be systematically exhausted. What remained when the Force was removed from his tactical toolkit was considerable, even if it felt, in this specific moment, considerably less than he was accustomed to. He had the Devastator and its full weapons complement. He had 3 additional Star Destroyers converging on his position within 4 hours. He had 19 years of military experience that predated his Force training and that his Force training had augmented but not replaced. He had intelligence data gathered from the ardent conviction sensor recordings of the relentless engagement, which he had studied for 11 hours during the journey here with the focused intensity of a man who understood that the information those recordings contained was currently the most valuable thing in the Imperial military's possession. And he had something else. Something that the institutional framework of Imperial military doctrine consistently undervalued to the point of active suppression, and that Vader himself had spent 19 years treating as a subordinate variable in the equation of power, and that the specific nature of this problem was forcing him to reconsider with an urgency he found deeply uncomfortable. He had people who were not him. The Devastator carried a crew of 37,000. Among those 37,000 were engineers who understood the specific principles underlying the relentless shield failure in ways that sensor recordings alone could not fully communicate. Scientists in the ship's research division who had been working since Vader had forwarded Brecht's initial report and Seniza's after-action data, spending 40 hours analyzing the energy absorption curves from the harvester shields and the weapon discharge profile from the city destroyer's primary beam. Tacticians who had been running engagement simulations in the Devastator's war room using the Ardent Conviction's complete sensor record of the relentless engagement as their baseline data. He had summoned them all to the main briefing room at 0330 hours, 30 minutes after the Devastator's arrival in Sector. They filed in with the specific mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline that came from being simultaneously sleep-deprived and aware that the person who had called the meeting was Darth Vader and that whatever was on the other side of this door was not going to be a routine operational briefing. 12 people. His chief science officer, Commander Lyra Tesek, a woman of 43 with the hollow-eyed focus of someone who had not slept properly in 2 days and was running on stimcaf and the specific narrow intensity that genuinely difficult scientific problems produced in people who were genuinely good at solving them. His chief weapons engineer, Senior Lieutenant Brant Orville, 29 years old and the most instinctively gifted ordnance specialist Vader had encountered in Imperial service, a quality that had kept Orville alive through 3 separate incidents that should by any conventional assessment have ended his career along with his life. His tactical analysis team of 4, led by Commander Dax Perrin, a quiet, precise woman whose engagement simulations had a predictive accuracy rating that the Naval Academy used as a benchmark for its own curriculum. And 5 additional specialists whose specific expertise Tesek had identified as relevant to the problem and whose names Vader had approved without review because Tesek's judgment about what was relevant had not yet been wrong. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the briefing table and looked at them and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you have found." Tesek spoke first, because Tesek had the most to say and because everyone else in the room was sufficiently aware of this to defer to her without requiring any signal. She pulled up the energy absorption curve from the harvester shields on the briefing room's main display, the same curve Brecht had shown Holst, the same curve Vader had studied on the journey here. And began talking with the focused efficiency of a scientist who understood that her audience was not looking for context or qualification, only conclusions and the evidence supporting them. The shield technology, Tesek said, was not a deflector shield in any sense that Imperial engineering recognized. Imperial deflector shields worked on the principle of generating an energy field that absorbed and dispersed incoming kinetic and directed energy attacks through a process of controlled dissipation. The energy of the incoming attack was spread across the shield's surface and bled off as heat and low-level radiation. This process had an upper limit determined by the shield generator's power input and the efficiency of its dissipation matrix. Push enough energy into a deflector shield fast enough and it failed, because the dissipation process could not keep pace with the incoming energy load. The harvester shield did not dissipate incoming energy. It absorbed and redirected it. The absorption curve showed no dissipation signature whatsoever. The energy from the relentless turbolaser barrage had not been spread across the shield surface and bled off. It had been taken in and stored, or converted, or used, in a process that Tesek's analysis could characterize in terms of its input and output profile but could not yet explain in terms of its underlying mechanism. What the curve did show, clearly and reproducibly, was that the redirection process was not instantaneous. There was a processing interval, brief, but measurable. Between the moment incoming energy contacted the shield and the moment that energy was fully absorbed and redirected, there was a window of approximately 0.003 seconds during which the shield's absorption matrix was, in Tesek's precise language, transitionally occupied. During that 0.003 second window, the shield's capacity to absorb additional incoming energy was reduced by a factor that her models estimated at between 40 and 60%. The table was very quiet when Tesek finished this sentence. Orville leaned forward. He was the youngest person in the room and the least senior, and he spoke with the slightly too fast energy of someone whose mind had gotten to the implication before his professional caution could stop him. If you could synchronize multiple weapons impacts to arrive within that window simultaneously. The shield would be receiving new energy input while its absorption matrix is still processing the previous input, Tesek said, with the tone of a scientist confirming a hypothesis she had already tested. The overlap would create a processing conflict. How significant a conflict depends on variables we can't fully model without more data, but the theoretical basis for shield penetration through synchronized saturation fire is sound. The relentless fired a convergence spread, Perrin said, from the end of the table. Her voice was even and analytical. Multiple impacts, but not synchronized. The spread was designed to maximize surface area coverage, not temporal concentration. Because our doctrine has never required temporal concentration, Orville said. We've never fought anything where simultaneous impact timing mattered. Our targeting computers aren't programmed to coordinate fire at that resolution. They can be reprogrammed, Vader said. The room looked at him. He had not spoken since his opening question, and the silence of his attention had a weight that the room's occupants had been navigating carefully for the past 20 minutes, each of them acutely aware that the black-armored figure at the head of the table was processing their words with an intensity that made normal professional pressure feel quaint by comparison. The targeting computer modification is theoretically straightforward, Orville said carefully, looking at Tesek for confirmation. The challenge is the precision required. We're talking about coordinating impacts from multiple batteries across a target surface measured in kilometers, with a synchronization tolerance of less than 1 millisecond. Our current targeting architecture wasn't built for that resolution. How long to build it? Vader asked. Orville and Tesek exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation compressed into approximately 1 second. With the Devastator's engineering resources and my team working continuously, Orville said, 18 hours. Maybe 16 if nothing goes wrong. We have 4 hours before the additional Star Destroyers arrive, Vader said. You have until then to give me a working prototype on one battery cluster. If it functions, we will replicate it across all available vessels before engagement. Orville nodded and was already standing, already mentally sorting his team into the task ahead, when Vader spoke again. There is a second problem, Vader said. The room waited. Their primary weapon, Perrin said quietly, from the end of the table. Not a question. She had been running engagement simulations for 40 hours, and she had seen what the City Destroyer's beam had done to the Relentless, and she had been thinking about the second problem since the first problem had started to look potentially solvable. Their beam weapon penetrated the Relentless ventral shields in 2.1 seconds, Vader said. If our synchronized targeting solution requires sustained fire against a City Destroyer to produce measurable shield degradation, we must survive their return fire during that window. Current shield technology will not accomplish this. Maximum shield output buys us approximately 2 seconds, Perrin said. Which means we need to be hitting them hard enough to degrade their shields faster than their beam can breach ours. Or we need to be moving fast enough that they cannot maintain a sustained beam lock, Tesek said. She pulled up a new display, the Ardent Convictions recording of the City Destroyer's beam weapon in the moments before it fired, specifically the targeting sequence her analysis had identified in the vessel's power signature. Their primary weapon requires a 4-second power buildup before discharge. During that buildup, their targeting array is fixed on the designated impact point. They cannot reacquire a new target mid-cycle. Evasive maneuvers at maximum sublight during their targeting cycle, Perrin said. Combined with the synchronized fire solution during their recharge interval, Orville added, his voice carrying the specific brightness of a person watching separate pieces of a problem locked together into something that might actually work. Vader looked at the display. He looked at the 4-second power buildup window. He looked at the 0.003-second shield absorption interval. He looked at the 2.1-second shield survival window. He ran the geometry of the problem in his mind with the precision of a tactician who had been doing this for 19 years and understood that what they were describing was extraordinarily difficult. A combat envelope so narrow and so technically demanding that executing it successfully would require a quality of coordinated performance from crews and systems that had never been tested at anything approaching this level. It was not impossible. It was the opposite of comfortable. It was the kind of solution that worked perfectly in a briefing room and fell apart in the chaos of actual combat when targeting computers glitched and shield generators ran hot and human beings in the middle of a battle made the small errors that human beings in the middle of battles inevitably made. It was a solution that required everything to go right, and invaders' experience everything going right was not a condition that combat reliably provided. But it was a solution. It was the first solution anyone in the Imperial military had produced that was grounded in the actual physics of what the harvesters were doing rather than in the institutional assumption that more firepower was always the answer to insufficient firepower. And it had come not from the Force, which was blind here, and not from the Imperial command structure, which had already demonstrated its capacity for catastrophic institutional failure in this situation, but from 12 exhausted specialists in a briefing room who had spent 40 hours looking at sensor data with the honest intention of understanding what they were seeing. Vader looked at his team. "Begin," he said. They began. The 4 Star Destroyers arrived in formation at 0712 hours, dropping out of hyperspace in a precise tactical spread that Perrin had calculated during the final hour of the briefing session. A quadrilateral arrangement with the Devastator at the forward apex and the 3 additional vessels, the Iron Hammer, the Relentless II, and the Sovereign Clarity, positioned at the trailing corners at distances calculated to maximize the geometric coverage of their synchronized fire solution while minimizing the exposure of any single vessel to sustained city destroyer beam lock. The formation looked, on the tactical display in the Devastator's war room, exactly like what it was. 4 of the most powerful conventional warships in the galaxy arranged with careful mathematical precision around a problem that had already destroyed one of their sister ships without apparent effort. Perrin had run the engagement simulation 47 times during the 4 hours between the briefing session and the fleet's arrival. In 31 of those simulations, at least one additional Star Destroyer was lost before the synchronized fire solution produced measurable shield degradation on the target city destroyer. In 9 simulations, 2 were lost. In 4 simulations, all 4 vessels were lost before the solution produced any result at all. In 3 simulations, 3 out of 47. The solution worked within the parameters they needed, degrading a city destroyer's shield sufficiently to allow conventional weapons penetration before the beam weapon cycled through enough firing sequences to destroy the fleet. She had presented these numbers to Vader at 0630 hours, standing in the war room with the simulation results on the display behind her and the specific stillness of a person delivering information they would have preferred not to be the one delivering. Vader had looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Then he had asked her one question. In the 3 successful simulations, what was the variable that distinguished them from the unsuccessful ones? Perrin had answered without hesitation, because she had been asking herself the same question since the 3rd successful simulation had resolved and she had gone back through all 47 runs looking for the pattern. Timing precision, she said. In every successful run, the synchronized fire solution was executed within a 2% tolerance of the theoretical optimum on the first firing cycle. In every failed run, the first cycle missed the tolerance window by more than 2%, which meant the shield's absorption matrix completed its processing interval before the second impact arrived, which meant no overlap, which meant no processing conflict, which meant no degradation. She paused. In practice, that means we need our targeting computer modifications to perform at the absolute upper boundary of what Orville's team believes they can achieve, and we need the gunnery crews operating those batteries to execute the firing sequence without error, under combat conditions, against an enemy that will be actively trying to destroy their ship while they do it. And if the first cycle misses the window? Then we adjust and attempt a second cycle during the city destroyer's beam recharge interval. But the beam recharge takes 11 seconds and a sustained beam lock takes 4 seconds to establish, which means our window for a second attempt is approximately 7 seconds after the first beam fires. She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had already made her peace with the number she was about to say. In the simulations, no vessel that took a direct beam hit during the first cycle's failure survived long enough to attempt a second cycle. Vader had looked at the numbers for another long moment and then said something that Perrin had not expected and that she would remember for the rest of her life, not because of its content but because of the way he said it, quietly, without the armored authority that normally surrounded every word he spoke, in a register that she had not previously associated with him and that she did not have an adequate category for. "Brief the captains honestly," he said. "All of it. The simulation results, the tolerances, the failure modes. They deserve to understand what they are attempting." She had done so at 0700 hours, in a subspace command conference with the 3 incoming captains. Mira Aldos of the Iron Hammer, Farron Galt of the Relentless II, a man who had specifically requested the assignment when he heard the replacement vessel was being commissioned under his predecessor's name, and Sean Orvek of the Sovereign Clarity, the oldest of the 3 and the most decorated. All 3 had listened to her complete briefing without interruption. All 3 had asked precise, relevant questions that told her they had understood everything she had presented. None of them had suggested that the odds were prohibitive. None of them had asked to be reassigned. Galt had said, at the end of the briefing, in the flat tone of a man stating a fact rather than making a speech, "The Relentless was my first posting. I was a junior tactical officer on her first deployment. 23,000 people." A pause. "Brief me on the targeting computer modifications." Now the 4-star destroyers held their positions in Peren's quadrilateral and the Harvester formation continued its advance and Orville's modified targeting solution was loaded into the battery control systems of all 4 vessels, having been replicated in the 3 hours between its prototype completion on the Devastator and the fleet's arrival. And the war room was very quiet in the way that rooms full of people who understand what is about to happen become quiet when what is about to happen has arrived. Vader stood at the forward viewport of the Devastator's bridge, not the war room, because this was not the kind of engagement that should be managed from a room full of displays. He wanted to see it. He wanted the specific discipline of watching it with his physical senses in the absence of the Force's guidance, because he had decided in the hours between the briefing and the fleet's arrival that the discipline of fighting without his greatest weapon was something he needed to practice consciously rather than simply endure, and the best practice was the real thing. The Harvester formation had not altered its advance at the arrival of 4-star destroyers any more than it had altered its advance at the arrival of 1. The passive sensor arrays of the Devastator registered the formation's composition with the completeness that 40 hours of continuous monitoring had built, the mothership at center, the 23 city destroyers in their patient orbits, the hundreds of attack craft in their fluid defensive sweeps. The formation's trajectory had not changed. Its speed had not changed. The only thing that had changed in the 18 hours since the Relentless had been destroyed was the 2 city destroyers whose trajectories had adjusted by a fraction of a degree, positioning them at a geometry relative to the Devastator's approach vector that Peren had flagged when she first noticed it and that Vader had studied with considerable attention. The Harvesters had moved those 2 city destroyers in response to his arrival. Not in response to the arrival of 4-star destroyers. The adjustment had been made before the other 3 vessels had arrived, when only the Devastator was on an approach trajectory toward the formation. They had moved 2 city destroyers in response to his specific vessel. He had not shared this observation with the briefing room. He had not shared it with Peren or Tessek or Ozzel. He had held it privately and turned it over in his mind during the hours of preparation and thought about what it meant that an enemy whose communications he could not intercept, whose intentions he could not feel through the Force, whose decision-making process was entirely opaque to every perceptual tool he possessed, had nevertheless identified his ship specifically and repositioned assets in response to his presence. They had felt him. Not through the Force. The Force ran in one direction in this context, and the direction was away from the Harvesters, not toward them. Through something else. Their sensors had detected something about his biosignature, or his ship's power profile, or some quality of his presence that distinguished the Devastator from other vessels of the same class. And the repositioning of 2 city destroyers suggested that whatever they had detected had been classified as significant enough to warrant a specific tactical response. The Hive knew he was something different. He held this thought and what it implied with the careful attention of a tactician who understood that information about what an enemy considered worth responding to was among the most valuable intelligence available. The harvesters had assessed the Relentless as a military asset and destroyed it efficiently and moved on without apparent interest in anything beyond the data its destruction provided. They had assessed his arrival differently. 2 city destroyers repositioned. Not to destroy him. If destruction were the immediate goal, the repositioning would have looked different, more aggressive, more consistent with an attack formation. The repositioning had the geometry of a containment response. Or an observation response. They wanted to study him. He filed this and returned his attention to the tactical problem. At 0731 hours, Vader opened the fleet command channel. All 4 ships, all 4 captains, the war room teams and the gunnery crews and the engineering sections monitoring their shield generators with the focused attention of people who knew exactly how long those shields would survive a direct beam hit and had every intention of not finding out if it could be avoided. All vessels, Vader said. We are going to engage the nearest city destroyer. Target the lead vessel, bearing 047 Mark 12. Synchronized fire solution on my command. Evasive pattern OREC on first beam targeting signature detected. We will maintain firing cycles through the recharge intervals until shield degradation is confirmed or until tactical reassessment becomes necessary. A pause. Captains. Your crews understand what they are attempting. I expect them to attempt it without hesitation and without error. 3 acknowledgments came back, each one clean and immediate. Vader looked at the city destroyer on his forward viewport. 15 kilometers of harvester engineering, dark and patient and entirely unconcerned with the 4-star destroyers arrayed against it. Beyond it, the mothership hung in its vast silence, and somewhere in the distributed consciousness that the hive represented, something was watching his biosignature with an attention that he could not feel through the force but that he could infer from the geometry of 2 repositioned city destroyers, and the inference was enough. Fire, he said. The synchronized salvo from 4-star destroyers was, in terms of raw energy output, approximately 4 times the firepower that the Relentless had directed at the city destroyer's shields in the 47-second barrage that had produced 0 effect. But the difference was not the quantity. The difference was the timing. Orville's modified targeting solution had coordinated the firing sequences across all 4 vessels to deliver impacts within a window of 0.0008 seconds, well within the 0.003 second absorption interval that TESEX analysis had identified, concentrated on a target zone approximately 200 meters in diameter on the city destroyer's forward shield face. The shield flared. Not the rolling aurora of the Relentless engagement, energy absorbed and processed with effortless efficiency. This flare was different, sharper, more concentrated, with a quality of disruption that TESEC, watching the sensor feed in the war room, registered immediately and flagged to the fleet channel with a single word that carried more relief than her professional composure entirely managed to suppress. Conflict, she said. The shield's absorption matrix had been caught in a processing overlap. For approximately 0.0004 seconds, less than half a millisecond, an interval that existed below the threshold of human perception and above the threshold of the sensor array's resolution, the city destroyer's shield had been processing 2 overlapping energy inputs simultaneously, and the processing conflict had produced a measurable reduction in absorption efficiency across the target zone. Measurable. Not decisive. Not a breach. A reduction of approximately 22% across a localized area, sustained for less than half a millisecond, already recovering as the absorption matrix completed its cycle and returned to full efficiency. In isolation, 22% localized reduction for half a millisecond was not a weapons penetration. It was a proof of concept. It was the most important sensor reading in the engagement. Because what TESEC's display showed in the 0. 4 seconds after the first salvo's shield conflict was that the city destroyer's power signature had shifted. The vast mechanical consciousness of the hive had registered the shield conflict, had detected, for the first time in this engagement, something that its sensors classified as a genuine energy penetration event, however marginal, and was in the process of doing what the hive always did with new information. It was adapting. The shield frequency was cycling. Not dramatically, not with the sudden violent shift of a system in crisis, but with the smooth deliberate adjustment of a vastly sophisticated technology responding to a novel stimulus with the unhurried efficiency of something that had adapted to novel stimuli many times before. The absorption matrix parameters were changing. The frequency window that TESX's synchronized solution had exploited was narrowing as the Hive's shield management systems recalibrated in real time, closing the gap that the targeting modification had found with the patient thoroughness of an immune system responding to a new pathogen. In the war room, TESX was already working, fingers moving across her display with the focused speed of a scientist whose hypothesis had just been simultaneously confirmed and superseded. The gap was narrowing. How fast it would narrow, how long they had before the synchronized fire solution ceased to produce even the marginal effect it had just demonstrated, was a calculation she was running in real time against a data set that was changing in real time, which was the kind of scientific problem that she found, in a deeply inconvenient way, genuinely fascinating. On the bridge, Vader felt the city destroyer's targeting array lock onto the Devastator. He could not feel it through the Force. He felt it through his tactical display, through the specific power signature shift that TESX had identified as the beam weapon's 4-second charging cycle, through 19 years of combat experience that translated sensor data into spatial awareness with an efficiency that approached but did not equal what the Force provided. The Devastator was in the city destroyer's targeting lock. The beam was charging. 4 seconds. Evasive pattern OREC, he said. All vessels. The Devastator moved. The Devastator moved with a speed and aggression that no Star Destroyer in the fleet's history had been asked to demonstrate, its sublight drives pushed to 119% of rated output by Chief Engineer Sovereign's counterpart aboard this vessel, a woman named Hast Orvan who had been informed of the beam weapon's 2.1-second shield survival window and had decided, with the specific pragmatic clarity of engineers everywhere, that if the shield was going to fail at 2.1 seconds then the solution was to not be where the beam was pointed when the 4-second charging cycle completed. The city destroyer's beam fired at the Devastator's last confirmed position and found empty space. The beam itself was extraordinary to observe even from the perspective of a bridge crew that was simultaneously managing emergency evasive maneuvers, monitoring 4 separate tactical feeds, and coordinating with 3 other Star Destroyers executing their own evasive patterns across the engagement envelope. It was the same deep violet as the beam that had destroyed the Relentless. Thick and absolute and moving at the speed of light itself, a column of converted energy wide enough to swallow a city block, and where it intersected the debris field left by the Relentless destruction 18 hours earlier it caught a fragment of durasteel the size of a small building and converted it to nothing in the fraction of a second of contact, leaving not even vapor behind. Just the sudden absence of matter that had been there and then was not. The beam held for 3 seconds and then cut off as the city destroyer's projector array cycled down for its 11-second recharge interval, and in those 11 seconds everything happened at once. Perren's voice on the fleet channel, precise and rapid, recharge window open. 7 seconds to next targeting cycle. All vessels, synchronized fire solution, second cycle, execute. Orville's modified targeting computers across all 4 Star Destroyers calculating new firing solutions in real time, adjusting for the shield frequency recalibration that TESX sensors had been tracking since the first salvo, narrowing the synchronization window from 0.0008 seconds to 0.0006 seconds to compensate for the absorption matrix's partial adaptation, pushing the precision requirement to a boundary that Orville had described as theoretically achievable and that the gunnery crews executing it were now discovering was achievable in the same way that catching a specific raindrop in a specific hand was achievable. Possible in principle, demanding in practice, absolutely dependent on the person doing it being very good at their job and very focused and not at all distracted by the fact that something was trying to kill them. The second synchronized salvo landed within 0.00063 seconds of concentrated impact. The shield conflict this time was larger. TESX's display showed a 31% localized reduction across the target zone, sustained for 0.0007 seconds before the absorption matrix completed its cycle. Still not a breach. Still a proof of concept rather than a penetration. But the number was larger than the first salvo's 22% and the duration was longer, and the trend line connecting those two data points, if it continued in the same direction across subsequent cycles, described a path that led somewhere the harvesters had not previously been required to go in this engagement. Toward the possibility of failure. The City Destroyer's targeting array locked onto the Iron Hammer for its second firing cycle. The Iron Hammer executed evasive pattern OREC and the beam fired into the space where it had been, and the recharge window opened, and the third synchronized salvo fired, and the shield conflict registered at 38% for 0.0009 seconds, and in the war room Tessek made a sound that was not quite a word and revised her degradation curve projection with hands that were moving faster than they had been moving 30 seconds ago. "Lord Vader," she said on the command channel, "the degradation curve is accelerating. Each cycle is producing greater conflict than the previous one. Their adaptation is not keeping pace with our synchronization precision. At current rate, I project shield penetration threshold within." She paused, running the number, between 7 and 11 additional firing cycles. 7 to 11 cycles. At a cycle rate of 1 salvo per recharge interval, 1 salvo every 11 seconds when accounting for the 4-second beam firing time, that was between 77 and 121 seconds of sustained engagement at current performance levels, assuming the gunnery crews maintained their synchronization precision, assuming the evasive patterns continued to prevent beam locks, assuming the harvesters did not introduce a variable that the 47 simulations had not modeled. The harvesters introduced a variable. It came from the mothership, which had not fired at any point during the engagement and whose weapon systems had not shown active charging signatures at any point in the 40-hour passive sensor monitoring period that had preceded the fleet's arrival. The variable was not a weapon. It was a movement. The mothership, 500 kilometers of patient dark geometry that had maintained its central position in the formation with the absolute stability of something that considered itself beyond the need for tactical maneuvering, began to move. Not toward the engagement. Not in an attack vector. It moved in a direction that Perren's tactical display registered and analyzed in approximately 4 seconds, and that she reported on the fleet channel with the specific tone of a person who has identified something significant and is not certain what it signifies. Mothership is repositioning. New vector is, a pause of approximately 1 second, it's moving to a position directly between the engagement zone and the remaining formation. It's placing itself between us and the City Destroyers. The room absorbed this. It's protecting them, Galt said, on the fleet channel, from the bridge of the Relentless 2. Not a question. A statement delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had been watching this engagement long enough to have developed a working model of harvester decision-making and who had just seen that model produce a prediction. "Or it wants a better angle on us," Aldos said, from the Iron Hammer. "Both," Vader said. He was looking at the mothership's new position on his tactical display and thinking about the 2 repositioned City Destroyers from 18 hours ago and thinking about Tessek's biosignature analysis and the force-blind silence that pressed against his awareness every time he reached into that silence looking for something to read and found nothing, and he was thinking about the specific quality of intelligence that made a decision like this one. Repositioning the most valuable asset in the formation into the engagement zone, and what that quality of intelligence implied about what the Hive had concluded was at stake in this particular engagement. The Hive was not protecting the City Destroyers. The Hive did not think in terms of protecting individual assets. Every unit in the formation was expendable if its expenditure served the harvest's progress, and the Hive had demonstrated this principle in its handling of the attack craft and the City Destroyer engagement with a consistency that left no room for misinterpretation. The Hive did not value its components individually. It valued information collectively. The mothership was moving closer because the Hive wanted better sensor resolution on the engagement. On him specifically. The synchronized fire solution had produced something the Hive had not encountered before, a genuine, measurable threat to its shielding technology. Not a decisive threat. Not yet. But a novel one, and the Hive's entire operational framework was built around the principle that novel threats required complete assessment before the harvest proceeded, because incomplete assessment led to inefficiency and the Hive found inefficiency genuinely intolerable. The mothership was moving closer because the Hive needed to understand what had produced this novel threat, and the sensor resolution available from 20,000 kilometers was insufficient for the quality of analysis the Hive wanted to perform. It wanted to see him up close, through whatever sensors the mothership carried that were capable of detecting his force signature. Or rather, capable of detecting whatever quality of his biological and energetic profile had registered as significant enough to reposition 2 city destroyers 18 hours ago and bring the mothership itself into the engagement zone now. Vader stood at his viewport and looked at 500 kilometers of harvester engineering accelerating toward his position and made a decision that he did not consult Peren or Tesek or Ozzel about, because it was not a decision that fell within any of their areas of expertise and because the window for making it was measured in seconds rather than the minutes that consultation required. All vessels, he said on the fleet channel, maintain synchronized fire solution on the city destroyer. Do not deviate from current engagement parameters. A pause. I am taking a shuttle. The bridge of the Devastator was briefly, profoundly silent. Ozzel broke it first, with the specific strangled quality of a man whose professional instinct to object and whose survival instinct to not object were fighting each other in real time. My lord, the tactical situation will continue to develop according to Commander Peren's parameters while I am absent, Vader said. She has the engagement. He turned from the viewport and walked toward the bridge exit with the absolute deliberate pace of a man who had made a decision and was implementing it. Peren. My lord, she said, from the war room feed, her voice carrying the composure of a person who had just been handed command of a 4-star destroyer engagement against an enemy that had destroyed 1-star destroyer already and was now advancing a 500-kilometer mothership into the engagement zone, and who was handling this transition with remarkable steadiness. 7 to 11 cycles for shield penetration, he said. Do not waste them. Understood. He was in the hangar bay 4 minutes later, in the Lambda-class shuttle Ardent, with a pilot who had been given 30 seconds to prepare for departure and had used those 30 seconds well. The shuttle cleared the Devastator's hangar magnetic field and accelerated toward the mothership on a heading that took it away from the main engagement zone, skirting the edge of the city destroyer formation where the attack craft patrol sweeps had been disrupted by the engagement's demands on the formation's defensive coordination. The patrol gaps were not large. They were large enough for a single shuttle moving at emergency speed. He sat in the shuttle's passenger compartment with the lights reduced and the force's silence pressing against him from every direction and thought about what he was doing with the honest clarity that the absence of the force, that great rationalizing, guiding, confidence-generating presence, forced upon him. He was flying a shuttle toward a 500-kilometer alien vessel whose occupants had no detectable presence in the force, whose intentions he could not read, whose decision-making process he could not model with any tool he possessed beyond inference and instinct, because he had inferred that they wanted to study him and his instinct said that being studied on his terms was better than being studied on theirs. And because of something else. Something that lived below tactical reasoning in the same place where the recognition had lived when he first read Brecht's message, where the understanding had lived when he reached into the force's silence and felt its quality. A thing he would not have named if asked, because naming it would have required using a word that 19 years of Sith discipline had methodically excised from his working vocabulary. He wanted to look at them too. The shuttle crossed the distance to the mothership in 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, behind him, the Devastator and the Iron Hammer and the Relentless II and the Sovereign Clarity fired their 5th and 6th and 7th synchronized salvos, and the shield conflict on the city destroyer's forward face reached 51% and then 63% and then 74%. And Tesek's voice on the war room feed climbed with each number towards something that was not quite excitement and not quite terror but lived in the narrow electrified space between them. The mothership did not fire on the shuttle. It opened. A bay in its vast underside, large enough to receive a vessel considerably larger than a Lambda shuttle, irised open with a slowness that suggested mechanisms operating at a scale where human concepts of fast and slow became approximate. Light spilled from the interior. Not the harsh white of imperial hangar bays but a deep amber green that had the quality of bioluminescence, organic and warm in a way that was entirely at odds with the cold geometric exterior of the vessel surrounding it. The pilot looked back at Vader. The question was visible on his face even through his helmet visor. Vader looked at the open bay and the amber green light and the silence of the force that told him nothing about what waited inside. "Take us in," he said. The shuttle touched down on a surface that was not a floor in any imperial engineering sense of the word. It was biological. The entire interior of the bay was biological, walls, ceiling, the surface beneath the landing struts, all of it composed of the same dark organic material that the mothership's exterior presented to space, but here, in the amber-green interior light, the material revealed a texture and depth that the exterior's darkness had concealed. It was layered, like the cross-section of ancient wood or the stacked geology of a canyon wall, with a complexity of structure that suggested growth over time rather than construction at a point in time. Conduits ran through the walls in patterns that followed no engineering logic Vader recognized but that had the coherent purposefulness of a vascular system. Carrying something, circulating something, maintaining the biological processes of a vessel that was, in some fundamental sense he was still processing, alive. Not alive in the way that a crew made a ship feel alive. Alive in the way that a body was alive. The mothership was not a vessel carrying organisms. The mothership was an organism carrying a mission. He descended the shuttle's boarding ramp with his hand near his lightsaber but not on it, a distinction that was partly tactical and partly something he did not examine too carefully. The pilot remained aboard, which was not a request Vader had made but which reflected a situational awareness he approved of. The bay was empty of any harvester unit he could see. The amber-green light came from the walls themselves, from structures embedded in the biological material that pulsed with a slow rhythm he recognized after a moment as approximately the frequency of a resting heartbeat, which raised questions he set aside for later because later was when he would have the luxury of processing implications rather than managing immediate conditions. He stood in the center of the bay and waited. The force told him nothing. The silence was absolute and it had the specific oppressive quality that it had been accumulating since his arrival in Sector, pressing against his awareness with the weight of something enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to what his awareness was accustomed to finding when it reached out into the living world. He had been managing that silence for hours now, building around it the tactical and analytical scaffolding that he had constructed in the briefing room and deployed in the engagement, and the scaffolding had held. It was holding now, though the specific conditions of standing alone in the biological interior of an alien mothership with no force guidance and no sensor feed and no communication with the Devastator beyond what the shuttle's limited comms array could provide were conditions that tested the scaffolding more severely than the briefing room had. He was here because the hive wanted to study him. He was going to give it something to study. The contact came not through any conventional sensory channel. No door opened. No harvester unit entered the bay. The contact came through the walls, a change in the pulsing rhythm of the bioluminescent structures, a shift in frequency that moved through the biological material of the bay's surfaces and produced a vibration at a register below hearing but above the threshold of physical sensation, something felt in the chest and the bones rather than heard with the ears. It lasted approximately 4 seconds and then stopped, and in the silence after it stopped something had changed in the bay that Vader could not identify through any of his physical senses but that registered as change nonetheless, the way the quality of air in a room changes when another person enters it even before they are seen. The hive was present. Not physically, no unit had entered the bay. But the quality of attention that the bay now contained was different from the quality of an empty room, and Vader, who had spent 19 years developing the capacity to perceive attention as a physical phenomenon through the Force, found that the capacity persisted even in the Force's absence. The hive was attending to him through the biological substrate of the mothership itself, through sensor systems embedded in the walls and ceiling and floor that were registering his biosignature, his mechanical components, the electromagnetic activity of his life support systems, and whatever quality of his presence had brought the mothership into the engagement zone in the first place. He spoke aloud, knowing the universal translator built into his armor's communication systems would attempt to encode his words into a transmissible format even in the absence of a known target language, knowing equally that the probability of meaningful communication through this mechanism was low, choosing to speak anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence gave the hive exactly what it wanted. An unresponsive subject to analyze without the complication of a subject that was also analyzing back. "You have been watching me since I arrived in this sector," he said. "You repositioned 2 of your city destroyers in response to my vessel specifically. You have now moved your primary structure into direct engagement range to obtain better sensor resolution on my presence." He paused. The walls pulsed. "I am interested in why." The response was not words. It was another vibration through the biological substrate, longer than the first, more complex in its frequency modulation, carrying a quality of structured variation that his pattern recognition instinct flagged as intentional rather than random. Not language. Not language as any sequential symbolic system would define language. But structured. Carrying something. The way a heartbeat carried information about the body's condition to anyone who knew how to read it, the vibration carried something about the hive's condition, its attention, its processing state, the quality of its engagement with the specific stimulus that he represented. He did not understand it. He recorded it through his armor's sensor suite and filed it for later analysis, and stood in the amber-green light of the living ship and thought about what he actually knew versus what he was inferring, which was a discipline the Force's absence was making considerably easier than it normally was, because the Force's absence removed the temptation to supplement genuine knowledge with the Force's intuitive guidance, leaving only what was actually demonstrable. What was actually demonstrable? The hive had identified him as categorically different from the other personnel aboard the Imperial vessels it had encountered. The hive had adjusted its tactical dispositions in response to this identification on 2 separate occasions, first with the city destroyer repositioning and now with the mothership's advance. Both adjustments had the quality of assessment responses rather than threat responses. Not attempts to neutralize a danger but attempts to improve the quality of data gathering on a stimulus of interest. The hive was not afraid of him. The hive had not been afraid of the Relentless or Scythe Squadron or the 4-star destroyers currently firing synchronized salvos at one of its city destroyers. The hive did not, as far as Vader could determine, process fear in any form that corresponded to the way individuals processed it. It processed information, and it adjusted its behavior in response to information, and the quality of adjustment it made in response to his presence was the quality of adjustment made in response to information that did not fit existing categories. He was a category problem for the hive. Not because of his weapons or his armor or his ship. Because of whatever quality of his biological and energetic profile the hive's sensors were detecting that they could not classify against any reference in their catalog. The force coupling that Tessek had identified in the biosignature analysis, the intense field interaction that distinguished him from every other individual the hive had scanned since entering this galaxy, was something the hive had no framework for. It was encountering, for the first time in however many galaxies and however many harvests, an organism that interacted with the fundamental energy field of its native galaxy in a way that the hive's extensive catalog of biological phenomena had no entry for. The Force was not available to him here. But the Force was why he was here at all. He ignited his lightsaber. Not as a weapon. He held it at his side, angled away from any attack geometry, the crimson blade casting its red light across the amber-green interior of the bay in a wash of color that turned the bioluminescent walls a deep burgundy and sent shadows into the layered structure of the organic material in ways that made the depth of the walls visible for the first time. He held it because the lightsaber was the most concentrated physical expression of Force interaction that he possessed. A weapon whose construction and function were inseparable from Force sensitivity, whose kyber crystal resonated with the Force in a way that any sufficiently sophisticated sensor system should register as distinct from the electromagnetic and plasma processes that a non-Force user might mistake it for. He was giving the hive something to scan. The walls responded immediately. The pulsing rhythm accelerated, not dramatically but measurably, the bioluminescent structures increasing their output in a way that suggested increased metabolic activity in whatever biological process they represented. Because of whatever quality of his biological and energetic profile, the hive sensors were detecting that they could not classify against any reference in their catalog. The force coupling that Tesek had identified in the biosignature analysis, the intense field interaction that distinguished him from every other individual the hive had scanned since entering this galaxy, was something the hive had no framework for. It was encountering, for the first time in however many galaxies and however many harvests, an organism that interacted with the fundamental energy field of its native galaxy in a way that the hive's extensive catalog of biological phenomena had no entry for. The force was not available to him here. But the force was why he was here at all. He ignited his lightsaber. Not as a weapon. He held it at his side, angled away from any attack geometry, the crimson blade casting its red light across the amber-green interior of the bay in a wash of color that turned the bioluminescent walls a deep burgundy and sent shadows into the layered structure of the organic material in ways that made the depth of the walls visible for the first time. He held it because the lightsaber was the most concentrated physical expression of force interaction that he possessed. A weapon whose construction and function were inseparable from force sensitivity, whose kyber crystal resonated with the force in a way that any sufficiently sophisticated sensor system should register as distinct from the electromagnetic and plasma processes that a non-force user might mistake it for. He was giving the hive something to scan. The walls responded immediately. The pulsing rhythm accelerated, not dramatically but measurably, the bioluminescent structures increasing their output in a way that suggested increased metabolic activity in whatever biological process they represented. The vibration through the substrate returned, complex and extended, lasting nearly 30 seconds with a frequency modulation that his armor's sensor suite recorded in full and that carried a quality of sustained intensive processing, the hive encountering the lightsaber's signature and running it through every analytical framework it possessed and finding, apparently, the same absence of classification that his biosignature had produced. It could not categorize what it was looking at. For the hive, which had catalogued the biology and technology of every civilization it had harvested across however many galaxies and however many iterations of this process, encountering something that fell outside every category in that catalog was an event of a significance that the individual mind had no real equivalent for. The catalog was the hive's accumulated understanding of the universe. The catalog was, in the most fundamental sense, what the hive knew. Something that was not in the catalog was something the universe contained that the hive did not know, and the hive's response to things it did not know was the same response it had been refining since its first harvest in its first galaxy: absolute focus, unlimited patience, and the complete dedication of whatever resources were necessary to transform the unknown into the known. The 30-second vibration ended. In the silence that followed, something changed in the bay more significantly than anything that had changed before. The amber-green light intensified across the entire surface of the walls simultaneously, a bloom of bioluminescence that lasted approximately 2 seconds and then settled into a new steady state that was brighter than the previous one by perhaps 30%. And in that new brightness, the layered structure of the biological walls became fully visible for the first time, revealing a depth and complexity that Vader had only partially registered in the dimmer light, structures within structures. Nested biological architectures of extraordinary intricacy, the physical substrate of a distributed consciousness that had been accumulating and processing and refining itself over a span of time that the Empire's 20-year history was not even a rounding error against. The wall directly in front of him changed. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden violence of a weapon deployment or the mechanical efficiency of a door opening. It changed the way living tissue changed when it grew. Slowly, continuously, with the patient purposefulness of biological process operating on biological time. The organic material of the wall in front of him was restructuring itself, the layered fibers separating and reorienting along new lines, the bioluminescent structures within it shifting their positions in the matrix as the overall topology of the wall surface transformed over the course of approximately 90 seconds into something that was not quite a display and not quite a window but that functioned, when the transformation completed, as both. What it showed him was the engagement outside. Not through a camera or a sensor feed in any technological sense. Through the biological substrate of the mothership itself, through whatever sensory apparatus the living vessel used to perceive its external environment, translated into a visual format that Vader could interpret. A representation of the space outside the mothership rendered in the amber-green palette of the bioluminescent material, with the 4-star destroyers and the city destroyer they were engaging visible as bright geometric forms against the star field, the synchronized salvos registering as pulses of concentrated light against the city destroyer's shield face, the shield conflicts visible as disruptions in the smooth aurora of the energy screen. He watched the 8th synchronized salvo land. The shield conflict on the city destroyer's forward face registered visually as a deep fracture in the aurora, not a penetration, but a disruption of a violence that the previous salvos had not produced. Tessek's voice came through the shuttle's comms array, patched to his armor through the bay's apparently permissive electromagnetic environment, carrying the specific controlled urgency of a scientist watching her model confirm itself in real time. Shield degradation at 89% conflict intensity on forward face. Lord Vader, we are approaching penetration threshold. 2 cycles, possibly 1. The hive's biological wall display showed the same thing Tessek's sensors were showing. The hive was watching its city destroyer's shield fail in real time and processing this information with the same analytical detachment it brought to every datum, and Vader watched the wall for a response. For the tactical adjustment that the repositioning of city destroyers and the advance of the mothership had established as the hive's behavioral pattern in response to significant new information. The city destroyers began to move. Not in an attack formation. Not toward the engagement. The 22 city destroyers that had not been engaged moved outward from the mothership in an expanding pattern that his tactical instinct recognized with a clarity that did not require the force to read. A dispersal pattern. Distribution of assets to prevent a single engagement from threatening the formation's collective operational capacity. The hive was not retreating. The hive was reorganizing around the new information that its shield technology had a vulnerability it had not previously cataloged, ensuring that the loss of a single city destroyer, if that loss proved unavoidable, did not compromise the formation's ability to continue its advance. And the engaged city destroyer did something that Vader had not anticipated and that the 47 simulations had not modeled. It powered down its beam weapon. Not because it was destroyed. Not because its systems had been damaged by the synchronized salvos, the shield had absorbed every salvo at reduced efficiency but had absorbed them, the hull beneath the shield was intact. It powered down its beam weapon and redirected its power output to its shields, flooding the defensive system with every watt of available energy in a last-ditch attempt to push the shield's absorption matrix above the penetration threshold that the synchronized salvos were approaching. It was, Vader recognized, the correct tactical decision. Whether it was a correct tactical decision was the wrong question. The right question was whether it was a sufficient one, and the answer to that question came 7 seconds later when the 9th synchronized salvo landed and the shield conflict intensity on the city destroyer's forward face reached 112% and the absorption matrix, overwhelmed beyond its adaptive capacity, failed. The concentrated fire of 4-star destroyers hit the city destroyer's hull directly for the first time. The hull was not unprotected. The harvesters had clearly engineered their vessels with the expectation that the shield might occasionally fail, and the hull material of the city destroyer was substantially more resistant to directed energy weapons than any material in the Imperial engineering catalog. The first direct hits produced damage that was real but not catastrophic. Hull scoring, subsystem failures in the outer layers, a fire in what Tessek's sensors identified as a propulsion cluster that the vessel's own biological repair systems began addressing within seconds of the breach. But the hull was not a shield. The hull could be damaged. And damaged it was, progressively, cycle by cycle, as the Devastator and the Iron Hammer and the Relentless II and the Sovereign Clarity maintained their synchronized fire with the focus of crews who understood what they were doing and why it mattered and who had not wasted a single one of the 11 cycles that Peren had told them they needed. The city destroyer's power output began to fall. In the mothership's bioluminescent wall display, Vader watched the amber-green representation of the city destroyer dim as its systems failed in cascade, the biological repair processes unable to keep pace with the rate of damage being inflicted on a hull that had never been designed to absorb sustained capital ship fire without its shield. The dispersal of the other city destroyers meant that no unit had repositioned to provide covering fire. The Hive had made the tactical decision to preserve the formation's collective capacity at the cost of the engaged unit, which was the correct decision by any strategic calculus that prioritized the mission over individual assets. The city destroyer died over the course of 4 minutes, which was considerably slower and considerably less absolute than the Relentless had died, but which was nonetheless final. Its power output reached zero. Its biological systems fell silent. The vast 15-kilometer vessel began the long drift of dead weight, no longer a unit in the formation's coordinated advance but a derelict, cooling slowly in the dark. On the fleet channel, no one spoke for approximately 5 seconds. Then Galt's voice, flat and precise, "Relentless sends her regards." Vader stood in the amber-green light of the living ship and watched the wall in front of him process the death of one of its city destroyers and felt the Hive's response to this event move through the biological substrate of the bay around him, not grief, not anger, not the complex emotional responses that individuals produced when they lost something significant, but something that he could only describe as a recalibration. A vast distributed intelligence updating its model of the engagement based on new and definitive information. The shield vulnerability was confirmed. The synchronized fire solution was viable. The civilization currently occupying this galaxy possessed, in at least limited deployment, a weapons application that could defeat Harvester's shielding under specific tactical conditions. The Hive processed this. And then the wall in front of Vader changed again. The amber-green representation of the external engagement dissolved, the biological material resuming its layered texture as the display function withdrew, and in its place the wall produced something new. Not a display this time. Something more direct. The bioluminescent structures within the wall aligned themselves along a new pattern, a spatial arrangement that his visual cortex and his pattern recognition instinct processed simultaneously and that produced, when the arrangement completed over the course of approximately 30 seconds, a shape. The shape was a map. Not a star map in the imperial cartographic sense, not a two-dimensional projection of stellar positions with navigational annotations. A three-dimensional representation rendered in bioluminescent light, showing a galaxy that was not this galaxy, and within that galaxy a dense cluster of worlds that pulsed with a rhythm different from the rest of the map, and beyond that galaxy a space between galaxies rendered in the deep amber of the wall's baseline light, and then this galaxy, and the formation's entry point, and the trajectory they had been following since Vasha's iron meridian had first registered their presence. The Hive was showing him where it had come from. Not as a negotiating gesture. Not as a communication of peaceful intent. The Hive did not, as far as he could determine, have a framework for peaceful intent in any sense that the word peaceful implied, the cessation of conflict, the recognition of another party's right to continued existence, the willingness to share a universe. The Hive's framework was the harvest, and the harvest was not a framework that included peaceful intent as a category. The map was not an olive branch. It was a data exchange. The Hive had spent the entire engagement studying him, running his biosignature and his lightsaber's force signature and every electromagnetic and biological datum his presence in this bay had provided through its analytical systems, and it had not been able to classify what it found, and the Hive's response to the unclassifiable was not to give up and move on. The Hive's response to the unclassifiable was to gather more data, and the most efficient way to gather more data from an intelligent organism that could respond to stimuli was to provide a stimulus and observe the response. It had shown him the map to see what he would do. He looked at the map for a long time. He looked at the galaxy it had come from, the cluster of pulsing worlds that his instinct identified as the harvester's point of origin or home territory or whatever the equivalent concept was for a species that moved between galaxies as a matter of operational routine. He looked at the path from there to here and thought about how long that path was and what it implied about the hive's patience and the scope of its ambition and the number of galaxies that might exist between its origin point and this one that might have received the same visit and produced the same result as the worlds the hive had harvested before this one. He thought about the Emperor. He thought about the message he would send when he returned to the Devastator. The report he would file that would reach Coruscant and the Imperial throne room and the ancient twisted intelligence that sat on that throne and had spent 20 years building an empire from the ruins of a republic, and that intelligence's response to the information that something was coming from outside the galaxy that had already harvested civilizations larger and older than anything this galaxy contained. He thought about the Rebel Alliance, scattered and embattled and currently devoting every resource it possessed to fighting an empire, and what the information in this map meant for the calculus of that conflict. He thought about a 9-year-old boy on Tatooine looking up at the stars. Then he reached out with one hand, the mechanical hand, and touched the bioluminescent map on the wall of the living ship. The wall pulsed once beneath his fingers. A single slow pulse, deep and resonant, that traveled through the biological material from the point of his touch outward in all directions simultaneously, like a stone dropped in water, like a heartbeat, like the first beat of something that had not yet been named. He held the contact for 3 seconds. Then he withdrew his hand, deactivated his lightsaber, and walked back up the boarding ramp of the shuttle. "Take us back to the Devastator," he said. The shuttle lifted. The bay's iris opened. The amber-green light receded behind them as they cleared the mothership's hull and the star field returned and the Force's silence continued its absolute oppressive press against his awareness, unchanged, giving him nothing. He did not need it to give him anything right now. He knew what he had seen. He knew what was coming. And he knew, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent 19 years serving a master whose vision extended decades forward and who had just encountered something whose vision extended across the lifetimes of galaxies, that the conversation he needed to have when he returned to the Devastator was not with the Emperor. It was with a princess. A senator's daughter. A leader of the only organization in this galaxy that had ever successfully made him reconsider a certainty. The shuttle accelerated through the patrol gap in the attack craft formation, through the dispersed geometry of the city destroyers, toward the 4-star destroyers holding their positions in Paren's quadrilateral, toward the Devastator and its 37,000 crew and the subspace transmitter that could reach any point in the galaxy if you knew the right frequency and had something important enough to say. Behind them, the Harvester formation continued its advance. Slower now. By a margin that the ardent conviction's passive sensors would register as statistically significant only when reviewed against the pre-engagement baseline. A margin that could be explained as natural variation in formation speed. A margin that Vader, who did not believe in coincidences and who had just spent 20 minutes in a bay that the hive had opened specifically for his benefit, did not believe was natural variation. The hive was still thinking about what it had seen. Good. Let it think. The Galactic Empire had been built on a single foundational premise, that power, sufficiently concentrated and sufficiently displayed, was the final answer to every question the universe could ask. 20 years of imperial history had validated this premise so thoroughly, so consistently, that the men and women who served the Empire had stopped thinking of it as a premise at all. It had become, somewhere in the space between doctrine and instinct, simply the way things were. The way things had always been. The way things would always be. The Harvesters had not read the premise. One city destroyer lay dead in the dark between stars, cooling toward the ambient temperature of space, the first Harvester unit lost in however many galaxies and however many harvests the hive had conducted across the incomprehensible span of its existence. It was a small loss by any strategic measure the hive applied. One unit among 23. One engagement among the thousands that the harvest would require before this galaxy was processed and the formation moved on to the next fold in space and the next civilization and the next assessment phase. The hive did not mourn it. The hive did not mourn anything. But the hive had slowed. And in the amber-green interior of the living mothership, in the biological memory of an organism that had catalogued every civilization it had ever encountered, a new entry had been made. Not for the synchronized fire solution, though that entry was there too, filed under novel weapons application, requires adaptive response, priority, high. Not for the 4-star destroyers or their captains or the exhausted scientists and engineers who had found a crack in what had seemed like an impenetrable wall. The new entry was for the being who had walked into the mothership alone, carrying a weapon made of light and crystal and something the hive's instruments could detect but could not classify, and touched the wall with a mechanical hand, and looked at the map of the hive's origin with eyes that did not show fear. The entry was brief, as the hive's entries always were. Precise. Stripped of everything except the essential classification. Unknown variable. Category, unresolved. Priority, highest. Vader's message reached Mon Mothma on a frequency that had not been used since Geonosis. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence contained no greeting and no political preamble. The second sentence described what was coming. The third sentence contained a set of coordinates and a time. She read it 4 times. Then she began making her own calls. In the briefing room of the Devastator, Commander Tessek and Senior Lieutenant Orville sat across from each other in the specific companionable exhaustion of people who have been through something together that has no adequate name yet. Between them on the table, a cold cup of stimcaf that neither of them had touched in an hour, and on the display above the table, the shield degradation curve from the 9th synchronized salvo. The curve that had finally, definitively, crossed the penetration threshold. Orville was looking at it the way a person looked at something they had made that had worked when it needed to work. 1 city destroyer, Tessek said quietly. Out of 23. It's a proof of concept, Orville said. Everything starts as a proof of concept, she said. Outside the viewport, the stars held their ancient positions, indifferent as they had always been, and somewhere in the dark between them the Harvester formation continued its patient advance, slower than before, thinking about an unknown variable that its catalog had no entry for, and the galaxy that did not yet know what was coming continued its ordinary extraordinary life, unaware that the conversation happening in the space between an Imperial Star Destroyer and a Rebel Alliance frequency had just become the most important conversation in its history.